Right, good morning. The time's now 9:30, so I'll resume the inquiry. So just to confirm, it's the inquiry into an appeal made by the Ismaili Trust under Section 78 of the Town and Country Planning Act 1990 against the refusal by Waverley Council of an application for full planning permission for erection of a funeral ceremony building at burial ground with associated landscaping and parking at Farnham Park Cemetery, land at Hale Road in Farnham. For anyone new today, my name is Gareth Wildgoose. I am an inspector and chartered town planner appointed by the Secretary of State to hold this inquiry. This is the second day of the inquiry, so first the usual reminders. Mobile phones and other electronic devices, please, can they be switched on to silent? Just give everyone a moment. Okay, and then just generally in terms of the overall running order today, we'll tend to look to break for lunch at around about 1 p.m. With suitable breaks mid-morning and in the mid-afternoon. Now, just for the purposes of the emergency evacuation procedures, can someone from the council please confirm the evacuation procedures?
We're not expecting a fire alarm today, but yeah, you just follow the signs out downstairs, and then we meet in the Berries car park out to the back of the council building, which is the other side from the town side.
Thank you. Okay, so yesterday we heard the openings from ourselves and the main parties and interested parties who could only attend yesterday. We do have a number of other requests for interested parties' comments that we'll be taking first thing, and then we're likely to take a break, and then we'll start with the council's presentation of evidence. That, in terms of the inquiry programme, that's scheduled to take much of the day. If possible, towards the end of the day, we may move into the appellant's evidence with the evidence in chief from the appellant's need witness. Does that's everyone's understanding in terms of that?
Yes, sir, that's right. Just one proviso. We discussed briefly yesterday whether if we made better than expected progress, bearing in mind Mr. McLaughlin's unavailability today, whether we might bring Miss Ritson forward. I think actually on reflection, unless you have a very strong view, otherwise, I'd rather not do that, because it seems to me logically she should go after Mr. McLaughlin, given he sets out the scheme design rationale and then she appraises it. It would risk putting the cart before the horse. So if you don't mind, I'd rather stick to that batting order, if that's okay.
I'm perfectly content with that. Obviously, we'll cross the bridge when we come to it. In terms of timings and how we make that work.
Thank you.
It just may be the case that we have to wait for Mr. McLaughlin's arrival.
Thank you, sir.
In that case, tomorrow.
Grateful.
I'm assuming that's okay with you, Mr. Green?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you. Are there any other procedural queries? As far as I'm aware, we haven't received any correspondence overnight. Obviously, we adjourned at lunchtime. Yesterday for the site visit. Site visit was completed, as was the request to view to the property. I haven't seen any emails that have come through to me since then. Is there anything I should have received?
No, other than I gathered there may have been an element of pre-arranged traffic and parking yesterday. I think it was requested of you to do another visit unannounced at a random time of your personal selection, and I'd commend that request.
Thank you, Mr. Banner. Like I said in the opening yesterday, it is my intention to do a number of unaccompanied visits. So I do feel like I'll get a feel for if there was anything untypical regarding the parking arrangements that were experienced yesterday. Thank you. Anything further before we move on to interested party comments? I'll list out the interested party requests that I have that I'm aware of, just to make sure that I haven't missed anyone, or if anyone needs to be added that we need to hear today. So I've got Councillor Carol Coburn, I've got Mr. Jeffrey Hogg and Dave Walter. Is there anyone else that had requested to speak that I've missed? Because that was the three remaining on my list. I thank each of you for your patience yesterday, because you were all in attendance yesterday and agreed to be heard today. Okay. No, nothing further. Well, in that case, unless there's any other queries from the advocates, then we'll move into interested parties. So, if I can have, if Councillor Carol Coburn, please, if you can just come to the witness table. Thank you. When you're ready, Councillor Coburn.
Thank you, sir, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to add a little bit to my written statements already. I'm Councillor Carol Coburn. I've been a member of Waverley Borough Council's Planning Committee for upward of 20 years, and I chaired the group that prepared the original Farnham Neighbourhood Plan in 2017, and also the group that reviewed the plan in 2020. That was in order to raise the housing target to 3,005 dwellings. I must say my support for neighbourhood planning remains undimmed. We had one of the last referendums for the review before COVID and the lockdown. We were right at the end of that period, and we still managed to get a 95% support of the people that managed to get to the polling station. So we were really thrilled. And we also were instrumental with a group of other people of getting paragraph 14 in the MPPF changed to extend the grace period, if you like, of neighbourhood plans. So neighbourhood planning is very much something that the town and I support. I learnt very early on as a borough councillor that planning permission is a decision based on policy about the land and not the applicant. In 2003, an inspector refused permission for a small hotel on this site, recognising that the land was not only designated as an area of great landscape value, but was also significant in landscape terms because it sits within this belt of open land that separates Hale from central Farnham. As the inspector confirmed, areas of great landscape value are not merely intrinsically beautiful, but they create separation and they provide settings for important assets within and around towns. The words of that inspector have been echoed by inspectors over the years. I've been party to all recent decisions on this site, including the change of use from agricultural to woodland burial in 2010. I was part of the committee which granted permission for a woodland burial site, but which insisted on the condition that no built form of any kind was to be allowed to maintain the openness of the site in perpetuity as part of the town's green infrastructure. I have not supported applications for housing development on this site and was delighted when the developer came to a meeting during the review of the Farnham Neighbourhood Plan to say that he was going to reapply not for large-scale housing, but for a change of use to Sang, with a view to this site becoming part of the natural extension to Farnham Park. After the Thames Basin Heath Special Protection Area was designated in 2005, there was a moratorium on all house building in Farnham until a scheme of mitigation was put in place. Eventually, Farnham Park was identified as a possible Sang, and after modifications, development could recommence. However, the capacity in Farnham Park was always finite and is now at its limits. This is a real problem for the town, as no residential development will be possible on brownfield sites without further provision. The borough is seeking other possibilities, and there are sites which might become available in the future. However, in the short term, important development sites will not be able to deliver the much needed homes within the town. I don't profess to be an expert on planning, but I am quite capable of talking to developers and commissioning the views of experts in other fields. The Farnham Neighbourhood Plan included this site as a SANG, as talks were ongoing between the developer and Waverley Borough Council at the time of the examination in public, and a budget had been set aside. An extension to Farnham Park SANG remains the aspiration of many in the town in order to create certainty around future development. The review team also took the opportunity to revisit all sites in 2018 and to refresh its landscape evidence. The team commissioned the Farnham Landscape Character Area Assessment during the review from Hankinson Duckett Associates. The document confirmed the importance of this site to the local character. After careful and impartial analysis, this site was described as having high landscape value and high landscape sensitivity. And it says advice from such experts that informed all the policies in the Farnham Neighbourhood Plan. The amount of built form alone would be sufficient cause for refusal of planning on this site. The scale, height, and uncharacteristic design of the main building, together with the ancillary development, would inevitably harm the openness of this long protected site. The simplicity of the woodland burial site would no longer protect and enhance the special landscape. However, the proposed use of the building cannot be ignored either. Urbanisation is something we all recognise, but for which we cannot find accepted definitions. However, we can all see the difference between tar and chip hard standing and naturally created paths. We can also hear increased noise, whether that comes from crowds, traffic, substations, or heat pumps. And we can also see harsh fencing and gates, which prevent the migration of important species. The use of the woodland burial site is not an issue. However, the proposed building and its frequent use is contrary to several policies in both parts of the Waverley Local Plan and the Farnham Neighbourhood Plan 2020. It not only harms the intrinsic openness and beauty of the area, but also harms the amenity of the local community with no compensating benefits. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Councillor Coburn. Would you be happy to answer questions from Mr. Banner? Mr. Banner?
Thank you, sir. Just a couple of points. Councillor Coburn, you refer to the neighbourhood plan. It's right, the neighbourhood plan didn't have regard to whether there was a need for Ismaili Muslims to have a consolidated site for ghusl, funeral, burial and after burial rites. That wasn't something that was taken into account by the neighbourhood plan, was it?
Thank you. The point was everything that was put forward to us was included. Yeah. I used to run the cemeteries in Farnham for my sins, and the cemeteries are all the same and they're for everybody to use. There's no cemetery building in use on any of our sites. Basically, the preparation of the body takes place elsewhere, and funerals the burials are then done according to the beliefs. We do actually have one Muslim burial in Badshot Lee, which is, out of sync because it has to face Mecca. We've never been exclusive, quite the opposite. And had they come in to talk to us, and I have to say, we were available every Friday morning at 10 o'clock for developers, people with land, anybody at all could come in and speak to us. So the fact that they didn't come in and tell us there was a need, it wasn't that they told us there was a need and we ignored it. It was never a question.
Can I have an answer to the question, please? The neighbourhood plan doesn't take into account, doesn't have regard to the sorts of need considerations that are now before this inquiry, does it?
No, but it doesn't go for a pet cemetery either because nobody raised it. You can't sort of, when you're doing a neighbourhood plan, you respond to what people say they want in it, and nobody came and told us.
And then you say in your written representations, you refer to previous decisions in relation to this site and indeed other site. And I think you probably have in mind in particular the Inspector Clive Hughes decision following an inquiry at which you turned up to object. Is that right? That's the proposal for 97 dwellings.
I presume I turned up, yes, sir.
Yes, you did. Is it your understanding that that appeal decision establishes a general principle that this site should not be the subject of any development?
No, it's not the appeal decision, it's the designation of the land. When we were looking for sites, we looked at all the sites and we measured them against a set of criteria. And any site that had high landscape value and high landscape sensitivity was automatically put on the back burner for development. And when we had to find sites for development, we originally had to do 2330 and it went up to 2780. We looked at all the sites and we looked at them sequentially. This site, because of its special designation, we decided, not to put forward for development.
Right, okay. You answered about the neighbourhood plan, but I was asking about the appeal decision, because you say in your statement very clearly that all applications have been refused, all applications have consistently been refused to oppose urbanisation of the site. And I just want to be very clear whether it's your position that the decisions, in particular the Clive Hughes decision, establish a principle this site, the principle of development of this site is to be opposed, or whether it was whether it's based on scheme specific factors.
No, it's not included in the neighbourhood plan, but that would not exclude me from supporting it as a Waverley councillor, because obviously when the application comes forward, we're given all the information and we could have a look and see where we go. But so far, and I'm only part of the committee, so far the committee has consistently, as have the officers, consistently refused built form on this side.
Well, I mean, I don't know, you have CD 11.4, it can be provided to you, the Clive Hughes decision. Given you refer to it, I'd like to just ask you a few questions about it. Could somebody provide it to you?
While we're waiting for it, can I just say that at the last planning meeting, we gave permission for 320 dwellings in Farnham and 3 in Hazelmere. So,
well done. You need a few more than that, won't you, given the current 5-year supply?
Indeed.
Can we just keep to the question and answers, please?
So,
Thank you.
Ms. Coburn, I mean, let me just, that was a scheme that concerned 97 dwellings. Yeah.
Sorry,
Do we not
Mr. Barrow. Councillor Coburn doesn't have a copy of 11.4 yet.
Does nobody have any hard copy? Well, literally the only person in the room that has a hard copy.
I've got an electronic copy. I've not got a hard copy, unfortunately.
Okay. That's not very satisfactory. Okay. Do you mind, Catherine? I think I would like just to go through this point, actually. Apologies that no hard copies. I'm a bit of a dinosaur these days about hard copies. Back when I'm on Mr. Green and I started, you had the whole set for everybody.
I in previous inquiries, I have had 7, 8, 9 boxes, but
yes.
I did want to try and avoid that for this inquiry. So
we can see what happens to my boxes with all the papers that's falling apart. I won't over labour this point, Ms. Coburn, but as you put it in play, I would like to just test it, and it will save time, perhaps later. Maybe Catherine, if you can sit there and help. I mean, that scheme concerned 97 dwellings, didn't it? 97 buildings as opposed to 1 building. So almost 100, almost 100 times the number of buildings that are proposed by this scheme. Yeah. Okay.
Indeed, but it's a bit like the Green Belt, isn't it? I mean, harm is harm.
Well, it's not like the Green Belt, actually. That's the point. But
well,
we'll come on to that with the plan.
But harm is harm, isn't it, Mr. Banner?
Yeah. Well, the harm depends upon the scheme, doesn't it? Now, in that case, the harm, if you go to paragraph 38, page 7. So I don't want to spend too long on this, but I just want to see if we can establish a few points. So paragraph 38 on page 7.
Mr. Banner, what paragraph was that?
38 on
38.
page 7.
Thank you.
And it's the second from last sentence. And into the third from last sentence. So we talk there, the inspector notes that the field to north and northwest would be surrounded by housing. Quite hard to be surrounded by a single building, isn't it? Wouldn't you say?
Well, it's impossible, but you're
Quite.
taking one sentence
Yeah.
out of one appeal decision.
Well, let's look at the next sentence. It would be clearly visible from the church and its graveyard. And just hold that thought. If you go to now to page 13, paragraph 69, that visibility from the church and the graveyard of those 97 houses in the last sentence 69 was found to result in harm to the character and appearance of the area and less than substantial harm to the setting of a listed building. So in that case, the 97 houses, nearly 100 times the number of buildings as proposed by the present scheme, was found to cause harm to designated heritage assets, wasn't it?
Well, I can only read
Yeah.
what it says
Yeah.
in the
Are
decision.
you aware that harm to heritage asset, designated heritage assets, carries specific weight? Because presumably, as you sat on committees, you'll appreciate there's statutory underpinning to heritage assets.
I do understand
Yeah,
the policies
considerable importance
related,
and weight.
but we didn't turn
No.
this down on, if I remember it, on HA1.
Well, I'm looking at what the inspector said on the appeal. And then also, if you could just have a look as well, please, at paragraph 64, the previous page. The appellant had said in that case that the development plan was out of date, and they said there wasn't a 5-year supply, and the inspector didn't agree. He thought the development plan was up to date. Somewhere he uses the word extremely up to date. Yes, here we are, 72, page 13. Parts of the development plan are extremely up to date, and there was a 5-year supply. Now, Waverley accepts that now, I think, doesn't it, in the context of housing schemes, that it doesn't have a 5-year supply. I think it could last one I saw was about 3.2 years, and the development plan's out of date. You're currently undertaking a review of LPP1, aren't you, which is overdue? Right, isn't it?
Yes.
So this decision was based upon a particular development, 97 homes, that caused heritage harm based upon a planning policy situation that's fundamentally moved on. That's
Then
right, isn't it?
Well, yes, sir, but
Yes.
every single planning application that comes in is dealt with the policy at the time, and they and you know, as I say, the guidance at the time. So I don't see really what point you're trying to prove.
The point I'm trying to make is that contrary to what you suggest in your written note, there's no established principle from appeal decisions that built form on appeal site can and should never happen. There was a rejection of a particular case put forward at a particular time based upon particular harms, all of which are quite different to the circumstances now prevailing. That's right.
Yes, it is.
That's
but
right.
I think
yes.
you're confusing what's in the neighbourhood plan with what's in the local plan and national policy. Because the local plan obviously takes account, the neighbourhood plan plays its part in the development plan, and that's up to date at the moment. But the circumstances change. When you're looking at something with a Waverley hat on, you're looking at all the policy right across the board and seeing what's available and what's suitable, deliverable at the time. So looking back at 2018 for houses and then trying to say that because I opposed that at that point, supported by the inspector, that therefore I automatically, wouldn't support anything on this site is nonsense.
Has it occurred to you, my last point really, has it occurred to you that actually what this appeal scheme would do, as well as providing all the benefits that we refer to, which is why we put forward the case, would actually be secure the protection of the appeal site with the high quality building, the protected landscape, and avoid any future development pressure, bearing in mind new government policy, bearing in mind Waverley can't demonstrate a 5-year supply, there's a crippling housing need for new allocations. Actually, what we would do is actually secure this site and preserve and enhance it, rather than risk it coming forward for housing development in future. Has that ever occurred to you?
With respect, Mr. Banner, a neighbourhood plan under the Localism Act is entitled to select sites for its own use, whatever it wants it to be. And providing it follows policy and providing it goes through the examining, we had 2 examinations in public, we were taken to court, we've done the lot. There's a difference between what the people of Farnham want and what you want. And with respect, we have been out twice to referendum, and both times we have had this site as a site down as part of the green infrastructure. And that we are entitled to do under the Localism Act. It's a totally different thing when you're looking at policy across the board. And yes, you have to take everything into account, but you have to take the neighbourhood plan into account.
Yes.
And we happen to think that the neighbourhood plans in this borough are very important documents.
The neighbourhood plan doesn't say there can never be any development on this site, does it? Doesn't say that.
It's a double negative, isn't it? Because basically we select sites
Yeah.
and they're all selected in policy 14 and they've all got their little guidance. So any site that's not selected, it is actually on the green infrastructure map as green infrastructure.
Okay, well, I'll debate that with Colette later, but thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure as always discussing with you.
Thank you, councillor Coleman. Jeffrey Hogg, please. Whenever you're ready, Mr. Hogg.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak at this appeal. My name is Jeffrey Hogg. I live in Oasthouse Lane, adjacent to the site. I am one of the elected spokespersons for my neighbours and other residents. For those interested in my relevant expertise and qualifications, and I know some people here are, by background, I was a Fellow of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors and a Chartered Arbitrator, with many years of professional management experience in various government departments. I strongly oppose the appellant's request for approval of a funeral ceremony building. The appeal isn't just about a single development, it's about the future of our community, the preservation of our open countryside, and the safeguarding of our shared heritage for future generations. I urge you to dismiss this appeal for material reasons I will outline. Despite recent changes to the original proposal, the core issues remain. This development is intended for designated open countryside. Adjustments aside, it would still be built in an area protected for its natural beauty. The land is not merely a plot for development, it's an integral part of our community's open space and deserves to be preserved and respected and not to be built on. What deeply concerns me is the appellant's complete disregard for established planning policies. The up-to-date Farnham neighbourhood plan, overwhelmingly supported by the people of Farnham, is the foundation of local planning decisions. It has been blatantly ignored in this proposal, of which key policies FN10 and FN11 are particularly relevant. Policy FN10 aims to protect and enhance the countryside from inappropriate development, ensuring that our green spaces remain untouched by unnecessary urban sprawl. The proposal put forward by the applicant directly contradicts this policy, as it seeks to build on land designated to remain undeveloped. Our countryside is a finite resource. Once developed, it cannot be reclaimed. Policy FN11 seeks to prevent the coalescence between Farnham and Aldershot. Part of what makes Farnham unique is the clear boundary between the town and surrounding countryside. This policy exists to maintain those boundaries, to prevent sprawl, and to protect the unique character of our countryside. The proposed development will erode this separation, merging areas that should remain distinct. Likewise, the proposal blatantly ignores key policies within the up-to-date Waverley Borough Local Plan, and in particular policies RE1 and RE3, which enshrine safeguarding the character and beauty of the rural landscape by restricted inappropriate development. Furthermore, the proposal blatantly ignores the restrictions placed upon the original Woodlands Cemetery 2010 planning approval, dictating, amongst other things, that there shall be no erection of monuments, etc., to safeguard the character and appearance of the area. Moreover, this development would sit dangerously close to important heritage sites, For instance, it would encroach on the setting of the Grade 2 listed St John's Church. This historic landmark is not only a significant religious site, but also a piece of Farnham's heritage central to its identity. Approval of this application would harm the church's character, obscure key views, and negatively impact how the landmark is experienced by residents and visitors alike. Farnham Park is another treasured site that would be impacted. This Grade 2 listed historic park and garden has been recognised for its historic and scenic value. Allowing development to encroach upon its boundaries would harm the park's open natural character and wildlife. The proposed development would bring urban sprawl right to the park's edge, undermining its historic value and its appeal as a scenic protected area. This is a consequence we should not accept. The land in question is also designated as an area of great landscape value and of high landscape value and sensitivity. These designations acknowledge the natural beauty of the area and importance of protecting it from inappropriate development. Allowing development here would degrade the area's scenic beauty, stripping away part of Farnham's identity and diminish a cherished resource for future generations. This development would also permanently change the character of the site. The open, unobstructed space currently offers a clear visual link to the surrounding countryside. Development here would erase this openness, replacing natural beauty with built structures. This isn't a minor change, it's a permanent alteration of the landscape that can never be undone. Once this countryside is lost to development, it cannot be returned to its original state. I'd also like to address the argument regarding the design merit of the proposed building. The appellant has argued that the building's award-winning design architect is reason enough for it to be approved. This is a totally ridiculous contention. If design awards alone dictated planning approval, any architect could propose developments in protected areas simply because of his award status. That's not how planning works, and it's not how we should decide the future of our countryside. Finally, let's consider the supposed benefits of this development brings to the local community of Farnham. There is no evidence to suggest that this proposal would improve the lives of local residents or address our community's needs. It does not provide new public amenities or other benefit for the wider community. Quite simply, it serves the interests of the appellant, not the residents of Farnham. By way of irony, the only tangible community asset, the provision of a car park for St John's Church, was arbitrarily omitted from the current revised scheme for reasons only known by the appellant. It is clear that approving this application would do nothing for the local community and, quite contrary, would instead come at a cost of our area's character, heritage and natural beauty. In conclusion, I urge you to dismiss this appeal. The proposed development violates key policies in the up-to-date Farnham Neighbourhood Plan and the up-to-date Waverley Borough Local Plan, and at the same time proposes to breach the original Woodland Cemetery approval, all of which were put in place to preserve our countryside and to maintain Farnham's unique character. The proposed development threatens important heritage site, degrades an area of great landscape value, and would irreversibly and detrimentally alter the landscape. This is not just about one building, it's about upholding our values, environmental stewardship, heritage preservation, and responsible planning. We must protect what makes Farnham special and safeguard it for future generations. I would suggest that the core issue for this appeal is quite simple. Should a building be allowed on this area of protected countryside? The answer is clearly no. This appeal should be dismissed. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Hogg. Would you be happy to answer questions from Mr. Bannon?
I think I would decline that.
Okay, that's absolutely fine. I've just got to confirm that the weight that can give your evidence, because it's not tested, it is slightly lessened by not answering questions, but that's absolutely fine.
Oh, okay, then, as long as
No, it's entirely your choice. You don't have to.
Do you know what? I'll make a confession that I wasn't going to have any questions anyway, actually, to be fair to you, just simply because I was going to deal, to the extent they haven't been dealt with already, with Mr. Steele. So
no, that's
that's
absolutely fine. So
I was willing.
It probably worked off okay for you in the end. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Dave Walter, please. Okay, can you share a copy with your colleague, just so that shot?
Slight challenge, my previous site this morning wasn't going to be well.
It's okay, if you could send it through to the case officer and we can print it up. It's just I can't accept something that has not been shared with the party.
I'm trying to be helpful.
No, that's okay. I'm happy to accept it as long as the party that we want to as well. Council's happy not to.
Of course, no, I understand that.
Okay, I'll accept it as inquiry document 6 as long as Mr. Banks.
Yes,
Thank you. Thank you for that, Mr. Walter. Like I said, I've accepted it as inquiry document 6. Whenever you're ready to start.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to the inquiry on behalf of the parish of Bagshot, Lee and Hale. I'm David Walter. I'm the PCC lay vice chair of the parish. We understand that there are many factors that will influence the outcome of this process, and there are many others who are better positioned to speak about many of them. So I will keep my comments to things related to the car park for St John's Church. I'll keep my submission short and focused because the inquiry has many things to consider, but not because we consider our points unimportant. There are 4 main components to our submission. Those related to the process surrounding the attempt to remove the car park from the application, the importance of the car park to the community and the church, the inclusive nature of the parish and flexible use of church buildings, including the use of St John's Church itself, which has a capacity of over 250, and the challenges of the conflicting use of the property of the proposed cemetery in the church, as was adequately demonstrated on the visit yesterday. Looking at the process as detailed in the submission by Farnham Town Council, we believe the request for the minor amendment to the application, including the requested removal of 23 car parking spaces, is not legal and is a material change to the application, so that the inspector should refuse the request for the amendment. Looking at the underutilisation of the church, past community surveys confirm beyond doubt that there is an urgent need for a community hub in Hale. St John's at Hale is the only building big enough to meet the varied needs. In doing this community work, the church will be open and accessible to the community every day of the week and will remain a place of worship open for baptisms, weddings, funerals, as well as normal Sunday worship services. Currently, St John's, which is a large, beautiful building, which isn't used as frequently as it could be by the local community. The main reason for that is the poor access and the lack of parking. It's impractical to run activities and events in this day and age that require equipment to be moved in and out of the building, even if you manage to park in the nearest location. The local community wish to see the building used more for community activities whilst continuing to be a place of worship. Without the car park and improved access, the future viability of St John's Church and the parish of Bagshot, Lee and Hale is in serious question. The car park will be a major step to ensuring the long-term survival of the Grade 2 listed building of exceptional historical, religious and architectural significance. Detailed plans for this future were drawn up prior to COVID, but these are reliant on improved car parking and access. Future uses are hoped to include a community cafe, clubs, activities for different strands of the community, and being a venue for concerts, exhibitions, and civic events. The parish of Bagshot, Lee and Hale, we pride ourselves on our inclusive nature. Facilities across the parish are regularly used by those of other faiths and those of no faith. We have particularly strong links with the local Ahmadiyya Muslim community who regularly use parish facilities. The Apostolic Church is another regular user of parish facilities, and our curate is a key participant of the local interfaith group. St John's Church itself has a capacity of around 250 and is a flexible layout for different activities. We're not aware of the use of the church building has been considered to support the activities of the proposed cemetery. Yesterday's visit highlighted the challenges of multiple activities going on in the area at the same time. You yourselves had difficulties parking, and that's the point that we wanted to make. The Currently, even for a church service of a modest attendance, the lay-by between the A325 and the proposed site of Farnham Park Cemetery becomes congested with parked cars. With cars parked for services or events, the flows of vehicles through the lay-by is very disrupted, and despite our best efforts, does periodically cause problems to the local residents and patrons of the restaurant. This is despite the relatively low traffic movements most of the time. It's hard not to see a chaotic situation when the use of the proposed cemetery and an activity at St John's Church overlap time-wise. Many of our current users are elderly with mobility issues. It's hard to see the volunteer traffic marshals doing more than telling the church users that they need to park further away. So contrary to the assertion in the attempt to remove the car park from the application that it is unnecessary, the car park for St John's Church is essential for the effective flow of vehicles when the cemetery is in use. We note the refusal to provide walking and cycling routes through the proposed cemetery, and we expect that this increases the likelihood that those in Upper Hale will use their cars when attending St John's Church. In conclusion, Bagshot-Lee and Hale is an eco and inclusive parish, and we care greatly for all people, regardless of faith, and for the environment. We also care deeply for the survival of this building of exceptional historical, architectural, religious, and community significance. This car park is essential to saving our church. We therefore humbly request that the church car park remains part of the planning application, enabling us to allow St John's to become a more open, accessible, relatable, and relevant for the service of the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Walter. Would you be happy if Mr. Banner's got any questions
I'll do my best.
to answer?
Just a couple, sir. In terms of the car parking stuff, I'll deal with Mr. Steele. But Mr. Walton, presumably you're very familiar with the inside of the church. I've been in the courtyard of the church. I haven't actually been inside. It was closed when I went, but you're familiar with inside, and presumably inside the.
Sorry, I am.
And are you familiar with inside? Is it the spire or the tower?
The tower,
The tower. You're familiar with the inside of that.
less so, but
Right. What goes on inside there?
inside the tower, nothing.
Nothing.
There is a bell in the
Right.
tower. It's used occasionally.
So it doesn't need to be that high. It's not the functional minimum. The church. The way
I'm
it's
not an expert on bell rigging, so
Right.
I can't comment on the need for the height of the tower.
Just the internal roof. Does it need to be that high?
Again, I'm
No.
not an expert on these things. I'm not in a position to comment.
No. But you're not aware of any functional requirement for the ceiling to be so high or the spire to be so high.
I am loosely aware of church buildings having good acoustics because of the positioning of their roofs.
Right.
So,
But there's no need for
bearing in mind that
outside.
singing and music is a
Yeah.
significant part of religious events.
Yeah.
I would contend that there probably is a need, but I don't claim to be an expert on the
But
matter.
I'm not aware there'd be any need for it to be exactly that height as opposed to 2 or 3 meters lower or anything like that.
I'm not in a position to
No.
disagree with you.
No. Do you think a sort of equivalent approach should be taken to considering the architectural merit of the proposed pavilion as we consider the architectural merit of the church?
Again, I don't feel in a position to answer the question.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Very nice to see you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Walter. Okay, that's all interesting parts on my list. There aren't anyone else in the room who wishes to speak. If there isn't, now might be an appropriate time for us to take a short break, and then once we return, it'll be the commencement of the council's evidence in chief. Yes. Thank you. So the time's 10:14. We'll adjourn till 10:30. Thank you all for your contributions so far. Okay, it's 10:30, so it's time to resume the inquiry. Just as the break started, I noticed that the advocates were having a brief chat regarding the programme. Are there any updates on that before we get into the council?
I think the main update
preparation
is,
of
is we think it remains valid. Other than Mr. Jivraj, we think may well end up being completed today as things currently stand. And then it will be Mr. McLaughlin and Mrs. Richardson tomorrow. My expectation is we'd probably, if that's what we did do tomorrow, even with a 10 o'clock start, we'd probably end up finishing a bit early tomorrow, but that's preferable to bringing on Mr. Vet for all sorts of reasons, basically.
Yes, I tend to agree. I think we'll take it as it comes to today. If we do get completely through your need witness today, then obviously we'll consider a later start time tomorrow to compensate for Mr. McLaughlin's arrival. Yes, and obviously then if we do get through the two witnesses, I think that will be enough for this week, considering the difficulty of bringing forward a witness now it's been advertised at this particular point. But then obviously that will give us being well on time in terms of in terms of the inquiry programme moving through to week 2. And it means then I can maybe formalise some of the programme in week 2 a little bit firmer, and it may result in us having a day less potentially of a day less sitting overall.
That may well be so. I think with Mr. Vet, but given that I suppose the main interest in her evidence is likely to be interest of peer persons. You're absolutely right, it's best we stick with her slot, but in terms of how long she will be, that's perhaps a little bit of an inevitable unknown, because it will depend upon how many questions there are from third parties.
Yes, I understand that. I understand that there's likely to be questions of witnesses, so that's why I'm not going to take for granted the fact that we are fairly on time at the present time, if not slightly potentially ahead of where we might be on the programme by the end of today. Okay, but no, thank you both for your ongoing cooperation in terms of timings, etc. Any further questions before we move into the council evidence? Anything from interested parties? Okay, Mr. Green, then, if you can call your witness. It may be better if you maybe sit in that chair while Mr. Green, you present your evidence from Mr. Green and then maybe move across examination.
Yes, a less interesting version of musical chairs.
Yeah,
So,
yes.
yes.
Unfortunately, I think we're making do with the arrangements that we've got. So I'll try and instruct people to sit in the seats where they are. I think for interested parties, I was conscious that for people being a bit more comfortable,
Of course,
because obviously it's an unfamiliar environment. But for witnesses, I think it's probably best to get in the right seat straight away. Okay.
So yes, and as you observed in this chamber, someone's going to have their back to some people unavoidably. So apologies to the interested parties who have a view of Mr. Collette's back.
I'm just hoping that with the cameras potentially it might pick it up. So at least we've got some form of compensation potentially that we may not have had in the past.
That's true, sir. I'll introduce you. Your name is Robert Collette. You're an Associate Director of Lucan Beck MDP Limited, a planning consultancy. You have a Bachelor of Arts Honours degree in Town and Country Planning and a Master of Town Planning from the University of the West of England, Bristol. You've been a chartered member of the Royal Town Planning Institute since 2003 and a practitioner member of the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment since 2010. You have over 23 years' experience of planning within the United Kingdom, advising on a whole host of different types of development. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. You've produced both a proof of evidence and a summary. And as the inspector has indicated, we're not going to go through your evidence in your proof in detail. I'm simply going to ask you, by way of setting the scene, to go to section 9 of your main proof and to read that out. And that's your conclusion section.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to ask you some supplementary questions.
Yeah, no, that's fine. The appeal scheme is said to be required to meet the needs of the Ismaili community in London and the surrounding area for a funeral ceremony building. The appellant has not sufficiently demonstrated the need for this building to be located in this location, or that a smaller footprint could not be provided to serve those needs, which would have a reduced size and scale. Furthermore, the building design, with the use of thatch roof materials, which is not local vernacular, has artificially and unnecessarily increased the scale of the building. The proposals are in conflict with the development plan when read as a whole, and with the framework policies in relation to the protection and enhancement of valued landscapes by introducing an excessive building in terms of size and scale, with associated infrastructure, including hard surface road with vehicle access, turning area and parking, that would have a harmful incursion into this open countryside location, AGLV, and area of high landscape value and sensitivity. The conflict with the development plan is not outweighed by other material considerations. Accordingly and respectfully, it is considered that this appeal should be dismissed and planning permission refused.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you supplementary questions on 4 topics in this order: landscape, need, design, and overall planning. So starting with landscape, could you take up Ms. Ritson's proof of evidence, please? If you go to paragraph 1.2.9, I'm just going to wait for others to get to it. But Ms. Ritson's evidence, paragraph 1.2.9 on page 3. This is in the part of the introductory section of her proof, and she's discussing methodology. And about 6 or 7 lines down, she says this: the SLR methodology regards major and major/moderate effects as important planning considerations in landscape and visual appraisals, or significant effects in landscape and visual impact assessments. Moderate effects are not generally considered to be important planning considerations or significant effects, although the assessor may conclude that some moderate effects could constitute significant effects in certain circumstances. For example, there may be a concentration of several moderate effects in one location, or a moderate effect may occur for a particularly sensitive receptor or be of a particularly high magnitude. Just the general approach. In other words, she appears to be saying one can effectively discount moderate effects. That's anyway how I read it. And I just wanted to understand how that sits with planning policy. Could you turn up the Waverley Local Plan Part 1, which is core document 7.1. And I'm going to go to policy RE3, which is at page 127 of the document. Do you have that?
I do, yes.
And again, for the benefit of those who don't have it in front of them, it's concerned with landscape character. It says new development must respect and, where appropriate, enhance the distinctive character of the landscape in which it's located. It's then split into a number of different parts. The first part concerns the Surrey Hills AONB, and it says that the protection and enhancement of the character and qualities of the AONB will be a priority. And then 2 areas of great landscape value. It says the same principles for protecting the AONB will apply in the area of great landscape value, which will be retained for its own sake and as a buffer to the AONB until there's a review of the Surrey Hills AONB boundary. Again, it goes on to recognise that that's a local landscape designation. So SLR methodology, if it's a moderate adverse effect, not significant. How does that sit, in your view, with policy RE3?
Yeah, I have some concern actually in the way that this methodology has been formed and applied. If a moderate impact has been, we're told to disregard it as not being important, that actually making a planning judgment under policy RE3, if we're to dismiss anything that's not a major or major and moderate impact, doesn't necessarily effectively consider the impact of the development, the intrinsic qualities of the site, or indeed protecting and enhancing the valued landscape, protecting the countryside from inappropriate development, and safeguarding the intrinsic character and beauty of the countryside. In my view, it's necessary to consider all impacts as being important. I accept that some will carry greater weight than others. But in order to reach a balanced and full judgment on whether harm has been identified and the policy test met, or whether there's conflict with policy, it's necessary to have regard and to consider all of those impacts, not merely to discount a moderate impact as not being important.
Thank you. That's RE3. I'm going to take you now to the Farnham Neighbourhood Plan, and that's core document 7.4, I believe. And I'm going to take you to page 44 of that document, which has policy FNP 10. FNP 10, headed Protect and Enhance the Countryside. It says outside of the built-up area boundary, as defined, priority will be given to protecting the countryside from inappropriate development. A proposal for development will only be permitted where it would, and then a number of criteria are set out, and one of which, D, is retain the landscape character of and not have a detrimental impact on areas shown as having a high landscape value and sensitivity. Again, how does the SLR methodology sit with that policy?
Yeah, I think here as well, the policy that we're being asked to apply is to retain the landscape character of and not have a detrimental impact on areas of high landscape value and sensitivity. In order to determine whether or not a detrimental impact is experienced, it's necessary again to have regard to the impacts and to consider a moderate impact as not being generally considered to be important in planning considerations, fails to have proper regard to the implementation of that policy test in order to determine whether there will or there won't be a detrimental impact.
Thank you. I'm going to move on now to a different point. Could you turn up Appendix B to Ms. Ritson's proof of evidence? And this is where she sets out her assessment of potential landscape effects. And at B1, there is a table where Ms. Ritson goes through the factors that are generally accepted to be relevant in assessing the value of a site in landscape terms, based on a technical guidance note. And there are various factors, natural heritage, cultural heritage, and so on, down to functional factors. And based on those factors, Ms. Ritson has assessed the value of the appeal site, part of the process in then determining the weight to be given to any impacts. The third factor is landscape condition, and she notes this: the site is in a moderate to poor condition. And she goes on to explain why. Who is responsible for the condition of the appeal site as it is?
The site is in the appellant's ownership, so it will be the appellant's.
Okay. In assessing the value of the appeal site, what is your view as to the appropriate, if you like, baseline? Should you look at the site as it is, or should you look at some other version of it?
Indeed. Yes, the site has been identified as being in a moderate to poor condition, as you've identified, and using examples of unmanaged hedgerows and grassland and the like. I feel that this statement is rather misleading in the fact that Ms Ritson, in her proof, has set out in several places what she refers to as the dynamic baseline. And at paragraph 5.2.13 of her proof, she states that any landscape of
Better just let
Yeah,
people
sorry,
catch
just
up.
just bear with me 1 minute.
No,
Was that 5.2.13, was it?
yes.
Thank you, I have it.
Okay.
thank you, yes.
Yeah.
So if you could read out the relevant
Ms.
passage.
Ms Ritson, in the first sentence of paragraph 5.2.13 says, any landscape and visual effects need to be considered in the context of the extant approval and the baseline which is evolving to respond to the approved change of use. To me, this is clear that Ms Ritson is looking to give some weight to the extant consent. The extant consent for the site has an approved landscaping scheme. The reason that the site may or may not be in the moderate to poor condition that Ms Ritson has identified may be purely down to the fact that the appellant has chosen not to progress burials on the site yet, but there is no indication that should this appeal be dismissed and planning permission refused, that there will be no burials on the site and the site will not come forward for burial use. That landscaping scheme that has been approved sets out a implementation strategy which is linked to burials taking place on the site. And I think it's reasonable to assume that actually with the proper implementation of the site and the landscaping that goes part and parcel with it, that actually the landscape quality will improve and yeah, it will no longer be in the moderate to poor condition that's suggested. And if I can just turn back to Ms Ritson's table, she contrasts the character of
Sorry to break your flow, Mr. Collins. Just making sure we're talking about the right
sorry,
table.
sorry,
that table
sir.
B.
Table B1. Apologies.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Good, thank you. Yeah, the condition of the appeal site contrasts with the well-managed landscape forming the immediate setting to the church. And clearly there's a contrast being made here between the condition of the appeal site and the condition of surrounding land. And it's reasonable to assume that if the site is properly implemented and the landscaping scheme come forward as approved, that the site will actually have a better condition than it is currently, and the consent will deal with the delivery of that proposal.
Now, if we take that approach and indeed adopt Ms Ritson's dynamic baseline of the current permitted cemetery and woodland burial site and the landscaping scheme and so on, what effect would that have on that element of the landscape? Ms Ritson has assessed it as low. If it's in the condition that it ought to be in with the approved landscaping scheme implemented, what do you say the assessment should be?
I would assume it would carry a higher value than low, because the council in approving a landscaping scheme for this site has sought to deliver a good quality landscaping scheme for the development.
Thank you. Now, one of the other factors is functional. Ms. Ripton says the site is located within the AGLV, which is defined by the adopted plan as a local landscape designation for an area considered to have high visual quality, complementing areas designated as AONB. She goes on to say, whilst there are views from within the site towards the AONB, the AONB advisor says the application site is a considerable distance, and therefore there would be, or there is negligible intervisibility between the two. Is that the full extent of its functional significance or value?
No, again, I don't believe it is. And if I can take you to another table, I'm afraid, in the appendices to Ms. Ritson's proof, and it's table A2 on page A4.
A4.
A4. This states, when looking at the criteria to be considered in assessing the value of non-designated landscapes, that landscape which performs a clearly identifiable and valuable function, particularly in the healthy functioning of the landscape. Apologies for flipping back to table B1. Ms. Ritzing has correctly identified the site does sit within the AGLV, but then the rest of the commentary in looking at the value, in evaluating the value of the site in its immediate context in this regard, is really concentrating on the AONB and the relationship to the AONB. What it doesn't do is look at the other policy tests that are in policy RE3 about appropriate enhancement of character, the fact that the policy sets out that this should be retained for its own sake, and also the importance that the Farnham landscape character assessment had in the role of this site in the wider landscape character area, in providing an important green wedge between Farnham and Hale, and in relation to other site assessments that look at the tranquility and the character and rural nature of the site.
Just pausing there, you have, I think, in your proof of evidence at page 13, an extract from the landscape character assessment. So it's probably convenient to look at that. I'm afraid my version is unclear, but so I hope you can read the extract. It's Mr. Collette's proof of evidence, page 13. At the top of it, at the top of the page, there is an extract from the landscape character assessment, or we can go to the document itself if that would be easier. So I can't read it. Okay. So what features or what functional features do you refer to?
Indeed, in looking at character area 6, cemetery fields, the level of landscape sensitivity and landscape value is both given as high, and the text within my figure 2, the table extract from the landscape character assessment, identifies this landscape character area as forming a critical part of the separation of Farnham and Hale, and as a peaceful and attractive rural landscape that is small scale and enclosed. It also recognises open views from the neighbouring cemetery and glimpsed views from Farnham Park. But whilst accepting that those could be mitigated, it concludes that development would be likely to harm local character.
Thank you. If the view is taken that table B1, if you like, fails to capture the full value or the important qualities of the appeal site, what effect does that have on the overall evaluation of landscape impact?
I think it's all about how you approach the evaluation of the value of the site, and the combination of all of the factors that are identified in B1 leads to there being no evidence which would elevate the value of the appeal site and its immediate context to above local authority value. And whilst the comments I've just made in relation to landscape condition and functional factors may not change the overall value of the site, they're clearly factors that help to inform the definition of that value.
Can we move on to table B3, please, which is Ms. Ritson's assessment of the magnitude of landscape change. And this is one component that leads towards the overall assessment of landscape impact, magnitude of landscape change. And one can see in table B3 that Ms. Ritson has broken down the landscape into a number of different elements, and she's assessed the impact on those elements that she's identified. So the first element is small fields, then hedgerows, tree belts, high voltage pylons, and so on. So features that make up the landscape. And in relation to small fields, there's an assessment of the magnitude of change. It's said to be small and slight indeed after development. Do you know what scale Ms. Ritson is working to? Is this site specific, or is this looking at the landscape character area itself, or some larger or different area of assessment?
By the reference to small fields, the appeal site itself.
Or is that, well, can you go back to B2, please? Table B2.
Yeah.
And it's essentially it's the same layout, assessment this time of sensitivity of landscape receptors. And we can see the same landscape components. And then in the notes, Ms. Ritson helpfully says the small scale rural landscape is a key characteristic of LCA 6 cemetery fields. So do you understand that to be a reference to the appeal site itself or the landscape character area?
So a reference to the appeal site within the wider LCA.
Okay. Going on then back to B3. Table B3, that is on page B6 as it happens. One can see in the notes, Ms. Ritson says this, 2 of the fields will be permanently converted into the wooded landscape associated with the burial ground in accordance with the extant permission, which applies to the majority of the appeal site. The change will be limited to within the site boundaries and will be permanent. The change from 2 fields to 1 wooded burial site will result in an overall slight magnitude of change across the rural small-scale landscape at year 1 and at year 15. Is there any mention there of the building?
No.
What effect, in your view, will the construction of the building have? Or rather, what is the magnitude of change brought about by the introduction of a building within the small fields?
I think it's probably worth clarifying. I didn't write this landscape and visual appraisal.
Of course.
But I think it's reasonable to assume that the introduction of a large funeral ceremony building as proposed would have a significant impact on the site.
And what about the introduction of internal roads or paths, as they're called, and the associated activity? What would that have any effect?
I think that adds to the overall scale of impacts, that by the introduction of a large road, which is capable of accommodating two-way traffic, we're told. The introduction of traffic into that part of the landscape and rural character, as well as the construction of the road itself, has a harmful effect.
We come at B4, which is the, if you like, the culmination of the previous assessments. B4 is the assessment of landscape effects overall, where the different factors we've looked at, magnitude, sensitivity, susceptibility, all that, they're brought together and one has the sort of overall assessment. And we start with the landscape components, small fields again, and one can see the landscape effects there are said to be moderate or minor and negative. What's your view of the overall landscape effects on the small fields component as identified by Ms. Ritson?
We're told that the landscape effect, both after construction and after 15 years, the point in which the landscaping would be matured, that there would be a moderate and minor impact in both cases. And looking at the nature of landscape effects, that a negative effect would result.
Yes. If, and obviously it's entirely a matter for the inspector, but if the inspector takes the view that the previous assessments on value and so on have underplayed or indeed ignored important features of the site, what would the consequence of that be for the overall assessment?
Well, if the baseline has been underplayed, to use your phraseology, it's reasonable to assume that the effect will be greater.
Now, as Ritson has, which is, I suppose, typical of the methodology employed by landscape witnesses, broken down, as I've said, the landscape into different elements. What sort of weighting, if any, should one give to these different components? In other words, should one give the same weight to the effect on small fields as one would give to the effect on high voltage pylons, for example, or are some of these more important than others?
I would say some are definitely more important than others. Impact on high voltage pylons, certainly lower significance. I think the impact on the site itself is more significant weight.
Thank you. I'm going to go now to Ms. Ritson's rebuttal proof of evidence, which is a response to your own proof of evidence. And one can see at paragraph 1.2.1, page 1 of the...
You just give me a second, sorry. Check my reference.
Sorry, I was slightly ahead, so I gave you the nod. So I thought everyone was at the same speed as me. Apologies.
Oh, thank you. Apologies, my folder has just come apart.
Take your time, no rush.
Yeah.
Sorry,
No, don't worry.
almost there. There we go. Apologies.
Thank you. And just by way of continuation of the previous line of questioning, just to make clear, I'm not going to ask you questions about visual effects because the inspector has seen the site for himself. He's going to form his own judgment. So I'm not going to ask you about Ms. Ritson's assessment of visual effects. The rebuttal, paragraph 1.2.1 says that no methodology has been provided for Mr. Collette's selection of visual receptors and how it's considered their sensitivity to the proposed change. And that's entirely a fair comment. You haven't provided a methodology in your proof of evidence. As a matter of policy, national policy or development plan policy and so on, is a witness or indeed an inspector required to adopt a particular methodology in assessing landscape effects and visual impacts?
Indeed. Yeah, I haven't provided a methodology, but nor have I also provided an LVA either. But what has to be balanced in making a planning judgment is the information contained within the LVA and balance that against the policy requirements set out in the development plan and in the MPPF and any other guidance and policy.
Thank you. Exception is taken, and if you go to paragraph 1.3.4 of the rebuttal, exception is taken, I think, to the use of the term urbanising, because you haven't provided a definition of it. So what did you mean by urbanising when you refer to that?
Yeah, urbanising is a generally used term, but what urbanising meant in this situation, at the moment we've got a situation of the part of the appeal site between Hale Road and with the access road in the centre and fields either side with a post and rail fence. That currently has a rural feel. What is being proposed is parking either side of that road, and whether or not the church car park is or isn't included, there's hard standing associated with the parking that would remain nevertheless, that would change the character of that entrance to the site from Hale Road. And the term urbanising is introducing hard standing parked cars, having a more urban feel than it currently is. Whereas at the moment it may have a more rural character.
Thank you. At 1.3.5, Ms. Ritson says that your assessment of effects on landscape are contradictory, and then apparently by way of example, it said that at your paragraph 8.2, table 2, you state that the proposal would improve the site's landscape setting. Whilst you agree with, whilst Ms. Ritson agrees with that, she says it's contradicted by your overarching argument in relation to effects on the landscape. So
Sure.
perhaps you can explain what you meant.
Perhaps just go to that
Go
table.
to your
Absolutely.
table, paragraph 8.2 of your proof.
Table 2, yes.
Whereabouts in the proof am I going to?
Forgive me, sir. It's Mr. Collette's proof of evidence.
Yep.
It's page 29.
Page 29. Yes.
Thank you. Paragraph 8.2. Yes. Thank you.
And here, 8.2, you're looking at the benefits of the scheme,
Yeah.
and third row, provision of a landscaping scheme. You say limited weight, or that's a benefit of limited weight. But then your overarching assessment is that the development will be harmful to the landscape
Yes.
as a whole.
Yes.
And it's suggested that that's contradictory.
Sure.
So can you explain?
Indeed. This part of table 2 and 8.2 is looking at the landscaping scheme. What it is looking at is the landscaping scheme as proposed by this appeal, and comparing that with the landscaping scheme that's already approved as part of the 2010 burial consent. It's looking at the differences between the two and concluding that just in terms of the provision of a landscaping scheme, this is without the building, that, yeah, there would be a similar improvement to the landscape setting. What it's not saying is that it's a overall landscape improvement, well, particularly when you would factor the building.
At paragraph 1.4.1 of Ms. Ritson's rebuttal, I'll just read out what's said.
Sorry, Mr. Green, I've just lost that paragraph.
I'm
I
so
didn't
sorry.
quite get the
It's page 2, paragraph 1.4.1 of Ms. Ritson's rebuttal. She says, and she's referring to your proof, paragraph 4.7, where you refer to and set out passages from various appeal decisions. And she says, it's noted that there's a general reliance on the inspector's wordings from appeal decisions which concern fundamentally different proposals for reference to the term open or openness instead of published landscape assessments or an assessment of the appeal site itself. And she questions whether an inspector's description of the openness of a different site should be considered relevant as each site is unique. And what's your response to that?
Yeah, I agree. Every site should be considered on its own merits. But what is important is that the appeal decisions that have been quoted are all within the vicinity of the appeal site. If they're not the appeal site itself or part of the appeal site. And what is important is understanding the context of the quality of the landscape, the openness of the countryside, and the general rural character, and compliance or not with policy.
Like, you know, of course, the inspector will see for himself what the decisions say, so he can form his own judgment of their utility or not. At 1.4.3, it's the last paragraph in Ms. Ritson's rebuttal proof. She says the proposed built form is focused to the least sensitive parts of the appeal site, and there's existing development in its immediate context. What do you say about the suggestion that this is focused on the least sensitive part of the appeal site?
Indeed. Yeah, focusing development on the least sensitive part of the appeal site. Yeah, we've got a red line drawn around part of the wider appellant land ownership of this land that has excluded from the red line boundary areas that are also within its ownership. We're told that by the blue line that is on the plan. And yeah, focusing on the least sensitive part of the appeal site. It depends where you draw the appeal site because it's part of a wider land holding owned by the same appellant. And sorry, sir. And clearly there are different sensitivities in different parts of the appellant's land holding. And we're told that, I think through reference, probably from Ms. Ritson actually, that she suggested, and we shouldn't look at other inspectors' decisions, but she relies quite heavily on the Hawthorne's decision, where the inspector in that decision clearly looked at sensitivity and the sensitivity of this landscape character area.
Mr. Green, can I just ask, have you got many remaining questions? Because I know you're pretty at your time estimate now.
So, yes, and I must make this confession. When I gave my time estimate, that was before I had seen the rebuttal proofs. So I'm afraid I will go a little over my time estimate, but I think we do have enough slack in the timetable to, I hope, to accommodate me.
Mr. Barry, are you happy for?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. I mean,
Yeah.
my time, obviously, the more evidence chief is, that may have consequences for my cross-examination.
No,
But,
that's absolutely that's absolutely fine. Just if you can advise me before you start, that would have. But I take the point. So
yes.
continue.
I'm grateful. So are there less sensitive sites within the appellant's ownership where a building could be located?
If we're looking at sensitivity in terms of topography, landscaping, screening, then quite possibly there could be less sensitive parts of land within their land holding.
Thank you. I'm going to move on now, and I hope speed up a bit on the issue of need. We've been provided with a need statement of case, a proof, and a rebuttal. What, if anything, do they tell you about the functional minimum needed to be served by the Peel building?
Sure. I think it's clear from the design access statement, we have to unfortunately take a couple of steps backwards, if you'll indulge me, Mr. Green, for a second, that the term functional minimum is referenced in the application design access statement. I'm assuming Mr. McLaughlin wrote that, or certainly his company did. And that is really in a response to pre-application advice that was received previously, where the council raised concern about the overall size and scale of the building. And Mr. McLaughlin advises in the design access statement that the building has been revised to what he terms the functional minimum. That functional minimum isn't defined in the design access statement, and indeed nor in the proof.
Does the appellant's evidence on need in the need statement of case, the proof, and the rebuttal, do they assist you in identifying what the functional minimum is?
No. Looking initially at the need statement of case, there is reference to carefully designed facilities. But what we're not told are those carefully designed facilities the minimum size that they need to be, or is it the minimum amount of accommodation that is required? All we're told is that they've been carefully designed.
Okay. Would you then turn to the transport assessment addendum, which is core document 2.12. And go to page 6 of that, please. Electronic page 6, anyway.
Yeah.
And we can see in the addendum, and it's also referred to in the transport proof of evidence, that a survey was done of funerals that are carried out at Brookwood. And we can see on page 6, there are two headings, number and size of funerals and development traffic. And we can see the data there. It says on average, 2 funerals occur each week. Actual number of attendees was counted over the 12-month period. And the bullets, there were 98 funerals over the 12-month period. Funerals range between 2 to 107 attendees. Average number of funeral attendees was 34. Mode was 26. 78% of funerals had less than 40, and there were 2 that exceeded 100 attendees. based on that data taken from another site performing essentially the same function, what do you take away from that about the capacity of the appeal building?
Sure. Well, looking at the data you've just read out, I think it's important to note that this is taken from actual survey data undertaken under a 12-month period, so not an insignificant amount of time. And what that has identified is that in that 12-month period, and we've no reason to assume that that wasn't a typical 12-month period, that there were, in total, 98 funerals over that period. And during that time, the maximum funeral attendance was 107 people. But that 78% of funerals had less than 40 people attend.
So what if anything, does that tell you about the intended capacity of the appeal building compared with what actually occurs at Brookwood?
Indeed. There is, I have to say, some conflicting information that's been submitted by the appellants. We're told in the design access statement the capacity that they had been instructed to design for was around 150 people. We've later being told in Mr. McLaughlin's proof that the hall has a capacity for 146 people, with capacity for for overspill for a further 35 people, taking that to a total capacity of 181 people. The 181 is generally consistent with Mr. Vett's evidence, where she talks about a maximum funeral capacity of 181 people. And Mr. Steele, in his proof, looks at potentially up to 150 people attendance, with circa for 180 with overspill. So what this tells me is, looking at the only evidence that has been provided in relation to actual funeral attendance, that a maximum funeral size is 107 people. Yet the building has been designed with a capacity of circa 181 people. If the overspill is taken into account, if the hall only is taken into account, it's still oversized at 146 people.
Can I just ask a point of clarification at this point? When we're talking about funerals on that in terms of funeral attendance, and obviously I'm mindful of what I've already heard and what may be to come in terms of what I heard from interested parties yesterday in terms of attendance by certain members of society at the burial, conscious that there may not be facilities at the Brookwood ceremony, Brookwood cemetery. When we talk about the funeral, is that the burial in terms of that assessment as far as you're aware? Because there may be, from what I've heard, there may be a material difference between what's been assessed there and the function of the building.
So can I just flag, Mr. Jivraj will give all that. I don't understand Mr. Collett's actually bothered to contact Mr. Jivraj to actually ask that question, but Mr. Jivraj will actually provide all of that information later on today.
That's fine, and if Mr. Collett doesn't want to comment on that particular point, that's okay, as long as I get that clarification in some form. I'm happy to receive it from Mr. Collett, or happy to receive it.
Absolutely. But you'll appreciate that we're responding to the evidence that's been submitted.
It was just whether the understanding was that it was the ceremony itself before Brookwood, or it was the attendance at Brookwood. I'm trying to understand from the evidence there.
Well, I'm not sure we can take that any further.
I think
that's absolutely fine. I'll leave the point in the air as long as you're happy not to comment at this point and allow it to be delivered in evidence by the appellant to respond to that particular point.
Well,
I will need to understand that point.
Of course.
Obviously, there's respective points being made here, and there were from interested party comments, and there's likely to be in the evidence.
Of
moving
course,
forward. So it's just flagging that point up
Yes.
right now.
Mr. Collett, as I understand it, you're responding to what's in the transport.
I am, yes. It's under a section titled Number and Size of
Yes.
Funerals, and it's talking about, attendance at funerals. I unfortunately, sir, Mr. Givraj might be in a better position. I can't provide more than has been stated in the evidence.
Yeah. Yes, but I'm just flagging up my part, and it
Indeed.
may be a point that comes to the fore as there's more evidence that's delivered that obviously Brookwood Cemetery, as far as I see it, unless someone wants to correct me, isn't necessarily a like for like comparison with what is intended in terms of as part of the appeal that's before me, and therefore I'll need to understand how we can compare those kind of figures in terms of what those impacts may be. And from certain evidence from certain parties may want me to find in different ways on
Of course.
different elements. So I'm just trying to get an understanding of the point that's being made in that respect.
Absolutely. Understood. But you'll appreciate the council's position is one of response. We're responding to a need case. We've made the point repeatedly. We don't think it's been established, and if we're going to get further evidence of this inquiry, so be it.
Actually, sir, I'm going to take that's not actually fair. You recall the CMC, we made a point that we sought engagement on need. There was a debate about whether the council's response to the need statement to common ground was sufficiently clear, and you encouraged the council to engage with the statement to common ground process. And obviously, we'll all be aware as well that the statement to common ground process is the subject of recent guidance in terms of the degree of cooperation required. Regrettably, that hasn't happened. These sorts of questions are precisely the kinds of things the statement of common ground guidance, and indeed the general approach of cooperation between the parties. Mr. Collett ought to have approached us during that process rather than, frankly, carp from the sidelines now, having not asked these questions in a properly constructive way before. It's exactly the point I was making to the CMC.
Thank you, Mr. Banner. I'm not going to criticise the witness necessarily on that point, because it is a query that I've raised just for my understanding, and I accept. Obviously, it helps if I get a response to the question that I've got from the witness. It helps my understanding of how the interaction of the points made in terms of the evidence that's being relied upon. But ultimately, it's a question that I would have had anyway. Of your witness,
unless it had been set out in the statement of common ground, had there been proper cooperation. That's the point, sir, that there were the complete ambiguity of the council's position in response to our need case has led to us not knowing what their position is, to be honest. So I make that comment. I'm not talking, your questions are absolutely valid, sir, but they're questions which could have been clarified had the council engaged properly.
No, I accept that, and I understand that these points may have been borne out through cross-examination in due course, but I was trying to see if I could ascertain an answer to it at this point, so that I could get my understanding of where this particular point's leading in terms of the comparison right now. I'm not going to criticise the witness or the council's approach and inability to answer that question. It's not circumstances that necessarily I shall comment upon at this particular point in terms of the process that's led to this point. All that I've asked the question is to assist my understanding, and I'll leave that point there. Obviously, mindful that cross-examination will follow. And there will be an opportunity for me to ask further questions once I've taken that into account.
So yes, I should make clear, I'm not going to make submissions now, but I don't accept for one moment Mylonderford's characterisation of the process, and the statement of common ground speaks for itself, frankly. Mr. Collett, I think we've dealt as far as we can with the issue of the need evidence. I'm going to move on to design, and I hope take that fairly quickly. A design brief has been referred to by various people now. Have you seen it?
No, I haven't.
Has it been disclosed by the appellant?
No.
In your proof, just to take this quickly, you identify, you refer to, I think, three particular features. There's the footprint of the appeal building, which is, I suppose, a product of the required capacity. There's the roof, its form and height and so on. And there's the projection over the approach road.
Yes.
You've seen the design evidence. To what extent does that design evidence explain, to your understanding, why the building is the size it is, why the height it is, and why it has to project, why the roof has to project over the road?
Indeed. No, I think it is the answer. It hasn't provided that information. I've already touched on, and I won't repeat what we've just talked about in relation to the size of the building. Mr. McLaughlin has set out, and I can appreciate the rationale of ridge height.
Just pause one moment, just and restart that sentence a little bit. See if it quiets down a little.
Yeah, I can appreciate Mr. McLaughlin's comments about the overall ridge height of the building. The ridge height being a product of the span of the building and the pitch of the roof, which reaches a natural ridge height. It's, I think, set out in my evidence, my thoughts on the use of thatch, because the use of thatch has been the reason for the pitch of the roof at the pitch that is proposed. The use of that material is not a vernacular material, and there are no examples of thatch, certainly in this part of Farnham and the wider area. But also the large projection canopy over the road. I can appreciate the desire for a canopy for the movement of coffins, the elderly and the infirm in inclement weather. I completely get that. But what the effect of that canopy, by continuing the design rationale of using a thatch pitch with a height as it is, that it significantly increases the overall scale of that roof, the dominance that it has in the landscape, and the visual impact that results in terms of the openness and character of this site. There has been, as I said, several mentions of design brief. It was clear yesterday from one of the participants, he referred to a design brief as part of an architectural competition. There were references to a modest scale building. That's as much as I can, I think, glean from what that design brief may or may not have been. It's certainly, Mr. McLaughlin refers in the design access statement and his proof to a brief, but that brief, unfortunately, hasn't been forthcoming.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the last topic, matters of overall planning. For the purposes of determining this appeal, we're not talking about housing development, but this appeal, is the development plan, in your view, up to date or out of date?
Up to date.
I don't know how long this song is going to go on for.
Any question comfortable? And I'll just open the window. Please.
Excuse me, sir, it's the nursery which is downstairs. And I have a feeling it's a pantomime because we keep having loud voices and that's when all the children go, woo. So I have a, you know, but
There is to a certain extent an unavoidable
I hope this is
kind of exercise at this time of year of having events, but I think we may have to keep the windows closed to minimise the noise as much as we can within the room. In terms of the temperature, was it too warm? Was there a request for the windows to be opened? Because they were opened during proceedings. I don't think they were open first thing. Yeah. I thought Dawson just to potentially turn the turn the air conditioning. I think it was a temperature check on the room from within the room. I believe so. I believe.
Actually, okay.
Well, so are you happy to proceed at the moment?
I'm happy to proceed as long as everyone can hear.
Yes.
I can hear as long as microphones are on. I'm assuming everyone in the room can hear now that it's not quite as audible now the windows are closed. Yes. It's a bit too early in the day, I think. Thank you. If we can proceed then.
Thank you, sir. We have the benefit, the delight.
Sorry, Mr. Green.
Sound coming purely through the door, not through the windows.
Well, it may be for those to the rear of the room, but I could only hear it coming from through the windows. If it is interfering with you hearing the proceedings, there are available seats a little bit further forward, which would be away from that door, which might reduce that interference if we continue. So it's up to you if you want to move slightly forward into some of these seats a little bit further forward if you're finding it too much of a distraction if it is coming through that door. Do you wish to move, or you? Yeah, I'll leave it in your hands. But if you do want to make that move, just let me know. If it makes it easier, if you can't otherwise hear the proceedings because it's distracting you. Now the windows are closed, that I've noticed a noticeable difference between that noise, the background noise environment. So I'm happy to proceed here with the option of people moving forward to reduce their distraction. Okay.
Thank you, sir. Yes, Mr. Collette, we have been blessed, obviously, with the revised National Planning Policy Framework.
Yes.
Has that made any difference to your assessment of the planning merits of this scheme?
No, there were no changes to the MPPF aside from paragraph numbers in relation to matters appropriate to this appeal.
Thank you. And finally, my learned friend put questions to Councillor Coburn earlier, and she was asked, had the neighbourhood plan anticipated or made provision for a funeral ceremony building to serve the needs of the Ismaili community across the southeast of England? Would you expect the neighbourhood plan to include provision for that?
No, I wouldn't.
Thank you, Mr. Collette. There may be some questions for you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Thank you, Mr. Collette. Before the appellant starts the cross-examination, I'm conscious, would everyone like a very short break for 5 minutes, comfort break?
I wouldn't mind, sir. And I think Mr. Brown is just printing out one document that we'll need. So yes, that'd be very
Yeah, yeah. So if we 5-10 minutes. So if we say we'll break at 11:40, it'll just be in a moment until 11:50. Then we'll proceed with cross-examination until 1 o'clock. My assumption is, Mr. Banner, you won't complete your cross-examination by 1 o'clock. So there will be a period where Mr. Collette will have to be separate.
Yes,
over lunch.
Best guess, it would be about 2 1/4 hours.
depends on its operation, but that's my best guess.
Thank you. Yes, yes. Okay, well, it's 11:40. We'll take a short adjournment until 11:50. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yes. Okay. No, that's fine. Thank you. Yeah, yeah, that's good. Yes, yes.
Yeah, brilliant, fantastic, yeah, brilliant, thank you.
Okay, it's 11:50, so it's time to resume the inquiry. It does seem like we still have some interesting background noises. Again, if you do want to come forward, it's entirely up to you if you're entertained by that, as much as you are by the inquiry. Well, feel free as well. But obviously, if you do need to hear proceedings, do feel free to move forward if it remove the distraction. Okay. Are there any points of note or procedural matters before we move into cross-examination? Whenever you're happy to start, then, Mr. Banner.
Thank you, sir. Colette, good morning still. Do you take up your proof, paragraph 1.4? You tell us there you were formally instructed in October.
Yes.
20. Was that the beginning or the end of October?
The beginning of October.
Beginning of October.
Yeah.
So that's about, give or take, about 2 months ago.
Something like that.
And when did you first visit the site?
I visited the site. It will have been about the middle of October.
After having been formally instructed?
Having been formally instructed, yes.
We can agree, can't we? The inspector obviously needed to have visited the site in order
Indeed.
to make his conclusions in this case, to do a site visit. Yes?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
So if it's necessary for the inspector to have seen the site before he can make an informed determination of the appeal, why was it that you felt you were able to accept instructions before having seen the site?
I reviewed the application, all of the pre-application information and the reason for refusal. I watched the committee recording, and in line with policy, I was happy that the reason for refusal was contrary to policy, and I could support that.
In a case where the reason for refusal concerns impact upon the landscape of a site, you can't have a fully informed view as to whether that reason is defendable without actually having seen the site, can you? Can you ask the question, please?
Indeed.
Sorry, just to confirm, yes or no answer, and then feel free to qualify it. But I so that I can actually hear the question and answer, please don't talk over each other. Okay, thank you.
Indeed. Sorry, Mr. Bang,
Question. Let me ask the question and I'll let you give the answer, but they're designed to be capable of a yes or no and then give whatever qualification you want. So in a case that concerns the effect of development on a landscape here, the effect on openness is how it's put, you can't have a fully informed view of the soundness of that reason without having seen the site, can you?
I think it is right. You can have a fully informed view. However, if I'm able to qualify that position. Yeah. The reason for refusal is such, as well as looking at, there are principles that are associated with the planning policy. There are policy tests that are set out within both the local plan and the neighbourhood plan that need to be met. And I was satisfied that those policy tests were not met from written information.
Even if that's right, of course, there's questions of other material considerations, aren't there?
Indeed, there are. Material considerations are important. And having reviewed the information, I don't think I would necessarily make a different decision on a material consideration having visited the site.
So let's be clear. You accepted formal instructions to defend the council's reason for refusal at a point where, on your own evidence, you now accept you didn't have a fully informed view about the soundness of those reasons. That's right, isn't it?
I think, about visiting the site.
Did you speak with the case officer, Mr. Brown, before accepting instruction?
Yes, I did.
And did you meet with him? How did you go about that?
Yeah, I didn't meet with him. We corresponded on email and telephone.
He had been deeply involved in the case. The application was validated on the 12th of January 2023, wasn't it?
Yes.
and determined on the 12th of March 2024. So
Yes.
in contrast to your 2 months involvement, he'd had a year and 2 months involvement in the case, hadn't he?
Indeed.
And informed by that year and 2 months involvement in the case, he'd reached the view that the scheme should be permitted, indeed was an extremely high quality design. Yes?
That was his recommendation to committee, yes.
He's been here, funny enough, he's not, I could have used another pantomime reference behind you, but he's been here most of the of this inquiry so far. Have you persuaded him to change his view?
Well, I'm not here to persuade Mr. Brown's view.
Sure. But I mean, presumably the fact that he's not giving evidence is indicative of the fact he remains of the view that this application should have been granted. Is that fair to infer?
I haven't had that conversation. I can't infer that. We're here to defend a committee decision made formally on behalf of the council.
Well, aren't you here to give objective planning evidence in accordance with your code of conduct?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Mr. Brown's recommendation to committee was just that, a recommendation. The committee were fully able and within their rights to reach a different decision on the basis of having considered the report and the information before them in making that informed decision.
Mr. Collett, so let's stick to the questions. I'm not asking about the committee, I'm asking about your process of ensuring that you're able to give fully informed objective evidence to this inquiry in accordance with your professional duties. And wouldn't it have been sensible to seek and continue to seek to engage with the case officer whose experience of this case is more than a year over than yours? Wouldn't it have been sensible to do that?
Well, I have continued to be in touch with Mr. Brown throughout this process.
You don't know what his view is now?
To be honest, we haven't had that conversation. What we've concentrated on is the council's reason for refusal, if I can be heard, and the matters before this inquiry. I think it's immaterial to whether Mr. Brown's view is or isn't the same.
You literally don't know what his view is?
No.
Take up it's very difficult.
Yeah. I think there does seem to be an issue when more than one mic is on. So it may be the case. It probably will help in you not speaking over each other. Is if the question, Mr. Banner's mic's on, then the answer, your mic's on, and then we'll avoid that annoying feedback. Councillor Coburn?
Yes, could I just ask that you actually have the microphone a little higher, please, Mr. Banner? I'm speaking on behalf of the people who are sort of leaning over, so I'm assuming you are finding it difficult. Yeah,
we can hear very little of what Mr. Banner's saying because he's not near the microphone.
When your voice goes down.
Mr. Collett, could you take up my opening, please? And you will see there that it's inquiry document 3, and on page 3 there's a quote from the DMPO. Could you take a look at that? Are you familiar with what that provision says, Article 35(1)(b)?
Yes, I am familiar with that.
And that's a legal obligation on local planning authorities where they refuse planning permission within the decision notice to state clearly and precisely their full reasons for refusal. That's right, isn't it?
Yes.
And would you agree that it's right for us to proceed at this inquiry on the basis that the council intended to comply with that legal obligation when formulating its reasons for refusal in the present case?
Yes.
It follows, doesn't it, that the reason for refusal, as set out in the decision notice, should be treated as a clear and precise statement of the council's full reason for refusal. Is that right?
Yes.
And it's not been amended, has it, in any way? Yeah,
it's not being amended, no.
And your instructions are presumably to defend rather than expand the reasons for refusal. Is that right?
Indeed, yes.
Therefore, if on a proper analysis, any of your evidence does in fact extend beyond the reasons for refusal and expand the reasons for refusal, the inspector should not treat it as part of the council's case, should it? Should he?
I don't think it's quite as simple as that. In the fact that we're here to look at the reason for refusal and other material considerations, and there may be other material considerations that weigh in the planning balance.
How, if there may be all sorts of, for example, SUDs could be a material consideration in some cases, but the material considerations which the council relied upon as supporting its reason for refusal had to be clearly and precisely set out in the reasons for refusal, didn't it?
That's correct, yes.
And so therefore, I'll repeat the question, Mr. Collette, again. If in fact, on a proper analysis, any of the points you make against the grant of planning permission fall outside the four corners of the reason for refusal, then the inspector should not treat them as part of the council's case, should he?
Well, again, with respect, and forgive me for interrupting, but if, for example, Mr. Collette is responding to evidence that's come in or points that are made regarding, for example, the justification for the scheme, then plainly that's part of the council's case. It may not be part of the reason for refusal, but it's not, can't be said it's not part of the council's case.
I think in my view, it'll be for the council to make out its position and the relevance of that. And obviously that's the reliance the council has to make on that point as what's material to that reason for refusal. So I'm happy for those points to continue to see where the cross-examination is going on this.
I'm just going to test this a little bit more, if I may, because and I'd appreciate it if the witness could answer the question rather than the council, if that's okay. Could we get up the reason for refusal? It's a core document 5.1. You let me know when you've got that. Do you have that? And can I just check, have you spoken with any members of the planning committee to gain any further insight into what they had in mind when they agreed this reason?
I haven't spoken to committee members, but I have watched the committee transcript.
Thank you. Now, we can observe, for example, the opening words, the proposed building, that the together with its ancillary infrastructure, and we'll come on to see what that means. It's those things, the proposed building and the ancillary infrastructure, which are said to cause the harm.
Yes.
Not the graves or the landscape.
Not the graves or the landscaping, no. And
the reason why the proposed building and the ancillary infrastructure is said to be unacceptable is due to its size and scale. That's what it says, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Not anything else, the size and scale.
Size and scale, yes. Then together with its ancillary infrastructure.
Now, just keep a finger, either finger or a virtual finger in the decision notice and go to CD 5.4. Bear with me, and we see 5.5, my apologies. The committee minutes. Wait, you see that at 6th of June 2024. Sorry, 6th of March 2024. Yes?
Yeah, yes.
And the last three lines, do you see the reference? Ancillary infrastructure, i.e. parking and landscape, parking and access.
Sorry, sir, could you just direct me to exactly where
Yeah, the
you're-
last 3 lines of that page, it says the committee raised concerns about the size and scale of the proposed building
Sorry, yeah.
and its ancillary infrastructure, i.e. parking and access.
Yes.
So we know from that that the reference in the decision notice to ancillary infrastructure is the parking and the drive, the access way.
I think by the use of IE, that isn't definitive, but that it just say IE, so it says, yes, such as parking and access.
I.e. it means that is. That's what IE means. It doesn't mean such as. It means
Indeed.
that that's what it is.
Yeah, and I think it's reasonable to assume that is the key elements.
So the elements that are said to generate the unacceptability of the building, the parking, and the access way. Yes?
Yes, if you mean by access way, the road that leads up to the building.
It can mean, can't it?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify your point there.
And it's not the substation, for example.
That's not referenced now in the minutes.
So the effect of the substation, which I think will be invisible anyway, I think it's accepted because of the planting, the effect on the landscape of the substation is outside the reason for refusal, isn't it?
Well, the reason for refusal says ancillary infrastructure, but I think by referring back to the committee minutes for clarity, that says parking and access.
Exactly. So the answer to my question is yes, the substation is outside the properly understood scope.
Yeah, and I don't think, that was the concern, the substation itself.
And then what it is about the size and scale in terms of the harm caused, its effect on the openness of the site, thereby impacting on the character of the area. So the impact on character is specifically on account of the effect on the openness of the site. It's not some other impact, it's directly as a result of the effect on the openness of the site, isn't it?
It is, of the size and scale of the building.
There's no allegation in the reason for refusal of harm to the setting of any heritage assets, is there?
There isn't, and I think that's agreed in the statement of common ground.
Now, the church is a heritage asset, isn't it? It's a listed building.
It is.
And the park is a registered park and gardens. No harm to the park.
No, I think the reason for refusal is clear in that respect.
And that means, therefore, there's no allegation of harm to the setting of the church or the setting of the park. That's also right, isn't it?
The reason for refusal relates to the size and scale of the proposed building. It doesn't reference the setting or not of a listed building.
And we're going to look at some other things that are not allegations of harm in the reason for materials. Not something, it's the size and scale. And I appreciate you say the choice of thatch has a implication for scale, which we'll look at, but per se in itself, the selection of materials is not something that's alleged to cause harm, is it?
Well, I think the choice of materials has led to the size and scale of the building. And yes, and I agree that is where the concern lies, and the scale is from the choice of materials.
So other than in relation to its implications for size and scale, there's no allegation of harm from the choice of materials, is there?
Not from the choice of materials, but in relation to the scale that they create.
There's no concern expressed about the proposed use of the building, is there?
No, there isn't.
So it's no part of the council's case, for example, that this might have been acceptable had it been a house, had it been an office, had it been a commercial use, but because it's a funeral pavilion use, it's unacceptable. Nothing of that nature that forms any part of the council's case.
No, and I think my proof is clear that actually, the principle of a building isn't necessarily in dispute here. It's the size and scale of the proposed building.
Be very clear, the council does not oppose the principle of a funeral pavilion building at the appeal site. It's just this particular building is too big. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think the reason for refusal is clear in that respect. It's the size and scale of the proposed building.
Just get a note of that, because it's quite important. The council does not oppose the principle of a funeral pavilion building on the site. It's just this one is too big. Is that fair summary?
And yeah, as a very high level summary.
Thank you. Now, also, it's clear, isn't it, that the impact alleged is on character. That's right, isn't it?
Yes. Carrot. Yep. Sorry. I think, yeah, the inspector helpfully summarised the key issues that we was all agreed at the case management conference. It looked at character and appearance, I think, of the OGLV.
Well, hang on. That's the inspector summarising all the issues it put forward by all the parties in the inquiry. I'm looking at what's in the reason for refusal here.
Yep.
So don't try and think ahead, because it seems you are doing so. Now, landscape and townscape character and visual effects are two separate things, aren't they? Hence, we call it landscape and visual impact assessment. They're two separate things. That's right, isn't it?
They are two separate things, yes.
And that's why, for example, in Miss Ritson's evidence, there's the B tables dealing with land's character, and then it's the C tables dealing with visual effects, yes?
Yes.
And the reason for refusal is directed at landscape stroke townscape character, not at visual effects. That is right, isn't it? Bearing in mind that this is a giving effect of the legal obligation to provide clear and precise full reasons. This is about character, not visual effects, isn't it?
I think that is fair, that it is about character as a product of the size and scale of the building.
There's no suggestion in the reason for refusal that the proposed development should be located elsewhere. Indeed, you seem to accept that it could be located here if it were smaller.
Yeah, yeah. We're looking at the size and scale of the building that's been proposed. It could be on the site of the appeal building. It could be potentially elsewhere within the appellant's landholding.
With that, is there a particular location within the appellant's landholding that you say it should be as opposed to where it is?
We haven't been provided with any alternative evidence to look at alternative locations on the site. As set out in my proof, I'm here to give planning evidence, not landscape and visual evidence. And by looking at some of the conclusions of other appeal inspectors, potentially looking at the Hawthorns, for example, to the south, he looks at the relative sensitivity of different parts of the landscape character area and accepts that there are different degrees of sensitivity. And whilst I have no evidence and I have nothing either to confirm that it couldn't go elsewhere, or any thought process to why it did go to the location proposed.
But just again, let's try and go back to what my question was. Is there anywhere specifically within the appellant's landholding that you say that the appeal scheme would be better, the building would be better located? Yes or no?
No.
And again, let's deal with this point now. I was going to deal with it later, but given that part of the function of the building is to enable those who cannot attend graveside to behold from afar behind the screen the burial process, it wouldn't be much use if you didn't have a direct view of where the graves would be, would it?
Well, I think this goes back to part.
No. I'd like an answer to the question first, please.
Mr. Colley, yes or no, and then qualify.
Could you re-ask the question?
I mean, it's fairly simple. It's got to be in a location where you can see what's going on. Otherwise, it wouldn't serve that purpose.
I would say no to that, but I would like to qualify why I'm making that answer if I'm able. And it goes back to the need argument and the need case that has been put forward. Looking at the way in which funeral ceremonies have been held for a long period of time at a different site elsewhere, no funeral ceremony building is available, but burials still occur. There's no suggestion in the evidence that burials couldn't take place if there wasn't a funeral ceremony building on site. And indeed, I think actually part of Mr. Jivraj's rebuttal says that in theory, the existing situation could continue, which would lead me to believe that actually it's not essential for the operation of the site as a funeral burial ground for the building to be located on the site.
Right. Okay. A number of points there. Firstly, you were actually here yesterday when all the people gave their evidence, weren't you?
I was indeed, and I listened hard to the evidence that was being put forward.
I mean, it's the point is made both by the people who spoke yesterday and by Mr. Jivraj, as we'll hear later on, that yes, burials take place in the moment in such a way that women and the infirm are unable to watch them, but that's a deeply unsatisfactory way of proceeding. So yes, that deeply unsatisfactory way of proceeding could continue, or it could be resolved through the consolidated building. You do understand that's the way it's put, don't you?
Yes, I do understand that position.
So, I mean, you say it's not essential, but that rather ignores the benefit, doesn't it, that would be gained through a consolidated operation where those people who are currently excluded from the burial process are not excluded. Simply saying it's not essential ignores that benefit, doesn't it?
It ignores that benefit as a material consideration, yes, but if you'll let me indulge you for a second, if you may, sir, that by an acceptance that in theory, the existing situation could continue, burials have successfully operated. I accept it's not an ideal situation. I'm not here to talk about that, but I think it's also worthy of note that whilst the land is owned by the Ismaili community, the proposal is by the Ismaili community, there is actually no restriction in planning terms that it would only be used by them. So in planning terms, we are looking at a use, not a user.
Well, I mean, if the council suggested such a condition or obligation, have you ever asked for that? Have you ever raised that issue?
No, I also don't think it's being offered by the appellants either.
Issues before the inspector then. Now, going back to your point about whether the building could be located in a different part of the appeal site, now that we're agreed that simply taking the view of whether it's essential for burials to take place for people to people who aren't able to stand graveside to view it, now you've accepted that ignores the full range of benefits. If we, going back to my question, where within the appellant's land holding should the building be located so that the building's benefits can be realised, it needs to be somewhere where you can see what's going on, doesn't it?
It does. Having listened to the evidence yesterday, that was right. But it's a very, very large site that isn't visible from every part of it. It's not visible from where that building is proposed.
Just again, continuing on the issues of what is and isn't within the reason for refusal. So just again, back in 5.1, we've agreed that visual effects are outside the reason for refusal. Coalescence is outside the reason for refusal. No allegation in the clear and precise full reasons for refusal. There's no allegation of actual or perceived coalescence between Farnham and Hale, is there?
No, it's not referenced in the appeal decision, albeit it does refer to openness.
But this is this is a different point. Openness, impact on openness does not equate to coalescence, does it?
No.
So we can agree, can't we, that any issue of coalescence or impact on the separate identities of Farnham and Hale is outside the scope of the reason for refusal. That's right, isn't it?
It's outside the scope of the reason for refusal insofar as, though, there is an allegation, council's reason for refusal on openness. But yeah, it's not part of the case that it would lead to the coalescence necessarily of Farnham and Hale.
Paul, I mean, they say these are clear and precise full reasons for refusal. An impact on openness does not, without more, amount to coalescence.
No, I
want
agree.
a clear answer, please, because you mentioned coalescence in your chief. It is no part of the reason for refusal that Farnham and Hale will coalesce or be perceived to coalesce. No part, is it?
It's not, no.
Tranquility. Another point you mentioned in chief, tranquility is, impact on tranquility is not something which is within the scope of the reason for refusal, is it?
Not insofar as the wording of the reason for refusal, no, it's not.
And the wording for reason for refusal is the clear and precise full reasons.
Yeah, indeed.
So it's outside the scope of the reason for refusal, isn't it?
I think the word tranquility, and apologies, I do remember using the word tranquility. I think I was using shorthand really, and I do apologise for that in relation to some of the conclusions of the Farnham landscape character assessment. But the word tranquility, I accept, is outside.
Tranquility may or may not be, we'll have a look, a feature of the landscape character area 6, but insofar as it is, there's no allegation that this appeal scheme would have an impact on it.
No.
And indeed, a general objective, general characteristic of burial sites, graveyards, and places where funerals take place is they're meant to be peaceful, tranquil places. That's kind of the whole point, isn't it?
Indeed, absolutely. And why the extant consent from 2020 is so distinct to the current proposal before us.
No, sorry, because a building doesn't create noise of itself, does it? A building doesn't have an impact on tranquility, it's the use. That's right, isn't it?
The building doesn't, but introducing roads to a building introduces traffic that can have an impact on tranquility. I accept, and I think we've agreed tranquility isn't part of the reason for refusal, but there are movements associated with the use.
And those movements are not alleged to have any unacceptable impact in relation to tranquility in the reason for refusal, are they?
In relation to the word tranquility, but they are clearly associated infrastructure.
I'm sorry, this is why I do need to focus on the reason for refusal there, but the infrastructure generally isn't part of the reason for refusal. It's the effect, and the effect in particular on openness, not on tranquility, Mr. Collett. That's right, isn't it?
On openness,
yes.
I agree with you.
Can we please stick to the reasons for refusal?
I agree with you on the openness point, yes.
And to landscape related matters. If you're acting electronically, probably worth keeping the reason for refusal to hand, but I'm going to for now move on to it. From it, sorry. And I'd like to go back to your proof, Miss Ritson's proof at 1.2. So let's get that. Now, it's on page 2 of her proof.
Yes.
And her qualifications include a bachelor degree in landscape architecture. She's a member of the Landscape Institute and then became a chartered member some time ago, 23 years of experience in landscape profession, etc. Now, you give your qualifications as a member of the RTPI and a member of the IEMA, but I just wanted to understand though you're a member of the IEMA, you're not a landscape expert, are you? Is that right?
I don't have landscape qualifications, and I think I've been clear in what my evidence is covering.
So you don't have any corresponding expertise of the nature set out by Ms. Ritson?
I don't have the same qualifications as Ms. Ritson, no.
Not just the same, you don't have corresponding expertise as the
No, or
nature?
corresponding, no.
Have you ever written an LVIA?
I haven't, and I don't think I've sought to here.
Well, you're not in a position, are you, to offer a competing assessment of landscape and visual effects, are you?
No, I think my instruction is limited to providing planning evidence, but in providing planning evidence, a planning judgment has to be taken, looking at the evidence before me alongside policy in order to reach a planning judgment in which I reach my planning balance.
Catherine, I'm going to have to circulate, in light of the way that the evidence is put in chief. Do you mind just handing the inspector, Mr. Clement? This is a document that I provided to Mr. Green earlier, and I take no great pleasure in putting this in. This is Mr. Green's got this. I've explained the point I'm going to put. I take no great pleasure in having to draw your attention to your professional code, but could we look?
Mr. Banner, are you intending it to be an inquiry document?
Please, sir. I've lost count actually there.
It'd be inquiry document 7.
7, ID 7. Thank you, sir. And I just want to understand how you see your evidence fitting in context of Rule 10 of the RTPI code. Because Rule 10 requires members to act within the scope of their professional competence in undertaking their professional planning services, and therefore perform those services only where they're sufficiently qualified by education, training or experience. And the reason I asked this, to be clear, Mr. Collett, is you suggested in chief that Miss Richardson had been, in your words, misleading in her approach to the landscape baseline, and then you took a fairly detailed critique of her tables in her proof. Now, it's right that the scope of your professional competence does not include application of the Landscape Institute's guidance, such as GLIVIA 3 or TGN 220, which you also referred to. Doesn't include that, does it?
No, it doesn't.
And you're not, and I don't mean this in any way disrespectfully or pejoratively, you're not sufficiently qualified by education, training or experience, either in the application of GLIVIA 3 or in the application of TGN 220, are you?
Not in relation to those, no.
And again, I wouldn't want to have to put any sort of allegation of non-compliance to the code, but can we put it this way, that the inspector should interpret your evidence in the light of Rule 10 and treat your evidence as not seeking in any way to apply GLIVIA 3 or TGN 220. Is that right?
It's not trying to apply either of those.
And similarly, the inspector should, in order to reconcile your evidence with the code of conduct, the inspector should treat your evidence as not suggesting Miss Ritson has misapplied GLIVIA 3 or TGN 220. You're not in a position applying Rule 10 to suggest that she's misapplied her own guidance.
I know, and I don't suggest that she has misapplied it. I think it's more a value judgment in the planning balance.
Just to pursue this one stage more, if you go to Miss Richardson's evidence, you took the inspector to what you called the evolving baseline 5213 on page 30 of her proof. And you suggested that her use of the baseline being the status quo of the site was, you say, your word was misleading. It's quite a serious thing to say in relation to a professional, isn't it? Say another
Indeed,
and
no disrespect was meant to Miss Ritson in in that suggestion. All I was trying to say was that in her words that, and her words are a dynamic baseline, that the landscape and visual effects need to consider the context of the extent approval and the baseline, which is evolving.
But the difficulty is, if you go forward to paragraph 6.4.7 on page 38, it's actually you who've been misleading, Mr. Collett, because page 38 on 6.4.7. You're the one who's been misleading.
Sorry, Mr. Banner, can I just catch up?
Yes, sorry, sir.
Can you give me an accurate reference?
Page 38, and it's paragraph, this is Ritson, page 38, paragraph 6.4.7. Where you didn't draw the inspector's attention to this. I don't know whether it's because you weren't aware of it, or you've forgotten it, or you just decided it didn't fit your narrative, but whichever reason it was, Ms. Richards sets out very clear that it's important to note the baseline in the LVA doesn't take account the remainder of the planting associated with explicit permission. The set's assessed against the current baseline in line with current guidance, which includes the Glivia Landscape Institute guidance, Glivia 3 and the TGN. But they should also be considered in the context of the extant approval. And she goes on to make clear how she's done that. So to suggest, as you did in chief, that she's not had regard to the approved permission is wrong, isn't it, Mr. Collett?
I accept here, Ms. Ritson does talk about the extant landscape scheme, but doesn't take away from the reference we looked at previously about the need to consider the extant and the appeal scheme.
But it does, because the point is that she makes clear at 6.4.7 that the Landscape Institute's guidance, the application of which you're not in a position to offer evidence on, requires the status quo to be treated as the baseline. And then she moderates that at 6.47, but say, nonetheless, I've had regard to the consent. So it's a complete answer to your point, isn't it, Mr. Collett?
I think, yes, yeah, and I accept what you're saying, sir, that there is reference to the extant permission and guidance on application of baseline. But notwithstanding that, when I've been looking at the planning balance, because I'm not here to provide landscape evidence, that I think it's important that the two are considered. But I accept the point you're making in relation to that paragraph.
It explains, and indeed you're not able from a landscape perspective to contradict it. In fact, the consequence of implementing the extant permission would be to increase the amount of woodland planting on the appeal site and thereby restrict further external views.
I accept there are more trees proposed, but however, the extant consent was deemed acceptable in order to make that scheme acceptable. That didn't include a large funeral ceremony building.
Point simply wasn't tested, that this proposal wasn't before the decision maker at the time.
It wasn't, nor was it the proposal.
To the extant consent and what it means in relation to openness later. But I just want to be very clear, given your evidence in chief on Appendix B, and given we've now put your evidence into the context of the RTPI code, you're not in a position, are you, to contradict or criticise the expert judgment she gives in Appendix B or indeed Appendix C? But given that visual effects outside the reason for refusal, it's B that's the one that's the focus. You're not in a position to offer expert evidence to either criticise or contradict those tables, are you?
I can't criticise those, no, because as we've established, I haven't got those qualifications. I think, however, all I was trying to establish in reviewing Ms. Ritson's evidence and trying to balance that against policy was reach a planning balance.
Let's then turn to policy. Now, Ms. Ritson at 5.1.8 of her proof page 27, 5.1.8, page 27, makes the point that in Glivia terms, when you apply the Glivia methodology, any new built form introduced into a greenfield site will inevitably result in some degree of localized impact and harm. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, I can accept that, yes.
Essentially, for whether for good or for bad, Glivia 3 always asks how bad is development rather than whether it's good or bad.
Yeah, if we're talking principle, yes.
Bear that in mind for the next question. Can we go to the policy? So let's go to firstly to LPP1 and policy RE1. Give me a moment. I need to reorganise my LPP1 policy RE1. And it's on hard copy page 113, so it'll be PDF 50 something.
57.
Yeah. And countryside beyond the green belt recognised and safeguard the intrinsic character and beauty of the countryside. That's not a zero harm policy, is it? It's not the case that any development causes any harm is necessarily in breach of that policy. Do you agree?
In principle, no. I agree with you.
And it's not a zero change policy either, is it?
No.
It doesn't refer to openness, does it?
It doesn't refer to openness, but it doesn't refer to intrinsic character and beauty.
Which may or may not include openness, depending upon the site.
Yes.
It's not, take for example, greenbelt policy protects openness, understood as unbuilt on land. It protects openness throughout the whole of the greenbelt for its own sake. RE1 doesn't do that, does it?
RE1, no, it's not a greenbelt policy. It doesn't seek to apply openness as greenbelt policy would, but is a character-based policy.
Given it's not a zero harm policy, we can agree that RE1 has what we might call a degree of tolerance of the inevitable adverse impacts of a greenfield development. One's looking for something more than the inevitable effects, but something sufficiently beyond that as to be objectionable. Is that right?
Yes, in principle, yes, I agree.
Just to test this, lest it be said otherwise by anybody, were RE1 to be a no harm policy with no degree of tolerance, then an awful lot of development which has been permitted in Waverley and which needs to be permitted in Waverley would be contrary to the development plan, wouldn't it?
If it was worded differently, clearly there are different considerations that are applied to each proposal on their own merits, though.
Can we look at RE3, which you were taken to in chief? It's a little bit later on, 127 of the bundle, so 65, 64. Now we're in the AGLV part, not the AONB.
Yeah.
And we can note two things about RE3, that there are two purposes of protecting AGLV, one for its own sake and two as a buffer to the AONB. Yes?
Yes.
And there's no allegation here in the present case by the council that the buffer to the AONB function is affected here. Is in fact the AONB unit, or what the management board, whatever they're called, they've issued a no object consultation response.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Yeah.
So we're considering only the for its own sake limb of the AGLV.
In relation to the AGLV, part of that policy, yes.
Is not part of the AGLV that's up for consideration as AONB, is it?
It's not, no.
And just to put some context on that, if we look at the supporting text, so go back a few pages to 1, 2, 3, which has, this is the supporting text to the to RE3.
Yeah.
And you can see there that there's effectively AGLV is being preserved until such time as the AONB review is complete. And then there'll be consideration as to whether the bits that don't go into the AONB should continue to be protected.
That's correct, and that process isn't yet complete.
That does indicate, doesn't it, that those parts of the AGLV which are up for consideration as AONB are higher ranking, because it's the parts that will be left over that may or may not be protected in the future.
Whether they're higher ranking, I don't think the policy actually gives a ranking to different parts of the AGLV. But clearly, if they're being considered as candidate AONB, there is, yeah, a landscape quality that may well follow. But until that process is complete, I don't think we can speculate whether parts are or aren't included.
It clearly does indicate, in terms of importance, whether it's cast as a matter of weight or a matter of importance. We look at 13.3.2, for example, the different categorization. There's those that have few or no characteristics of the AONB, those that have some characteristics with the AONB, and those that are identical with the AONB. And there's a discussion here of the AGLV in RE3 is effectively holding the ring until the process of identifying which bits should be added to the AONB is complete.
I accept it's waiting until the AONB review is complete.
And it does follow, doesn't it, therefore, that in terms of order of importance, as I say, at least in the context of weight, part of the AGLV that's not up for consideration as AONB scores less weight in the balance than part that would be up for consideration as AONB. Would you not agree with that?
That isn't what the wording of the policy says.
Asking for your planning judgment.
In my planning judgment, looking at the planning balance, then yes, I could agree it was more sensitive, but that wouldn't be the application of applying that development plan policy or that part of the development plan policy.
RE3, both in the supporting text and in the policy itself, certainly the relevant part of the policy, doesn't refer to openness, does it?
No, it doesn't.
And it, again, like RE1, it doesn't suggest that openness should be protected for its own sake in the way the Greenbelt policy does.
So could you ask that question again?
Again, we agreed that RE1 doesn't protect openness for its own sake in the way that Greenbelt policy does. It doesn't treat an impact on openness as a bad thing in itself.
I accept that.
Ditto RE3. That's right, isn't it?
In the fact it wouldn't preclude development, but it is to be retained for its own sake, which I think is different to wording in policy RE1 that doesn't talk about its own sake.
Well, it says will be retained for its own sake. That doesn't mean will be left undeveloped or that openness will be protected for its own sake. It's a different point, isn't it? It's retaining the AGLV.
It's retaining the AGLV in relation to the first part of that policy about respecting and, where appropriate, enhancing the distinctive character of the landscape.
So is it your view, again, bearing in mind, for example, the fact that there are allocations in AGLV by this council and it's granted permission for AGLV in Hazelmere, for example, is it your view that RE3 is a zero harm policy, that if you, or a zero development policy, that you can't develop in the AGLV or you can't have any harm in the AGLV, or does it, like RE1, have a degree of tolerance?
I agree, it has a degree of tolerance. It doesn't say all development is unacceptable, nor does it say that every development will be unacceptable. It's got to respect and, where appropriate, enhance the distinctive character of the landscape.
And so if, for example, the inspector were to consider that the appeal scheme, we know it doesn't harm the setting of the RPG or the church, if he was to consider it as a high quality design, that would be, for those who could see it, they would think it was extremely attractive and high quality. And if he thought that the landscaping, reintroducing the historic treescape that was previously on the site, that the landscaping was high quality, if he were to be of that view, it would be possible for him to conclude that the appeal scheme was in accordance with RE3, wouldn't it?
In considering all the matters, this policy doesn't preclude development. The answer was yes. Sorry. Yes.
Sorry, Mr. Bannon, just put your microphone on, please.
Thank you. No, before we go back to Mr. Richardson's proof, can we go to the neighbourhood plan? And so it's Farnham neighbourhood plan, please. And again, just looking at the two policies, I'm only looking at the policy site and the reasons for refusal, and I'm not going to go through all the DM policies because essentially they make the same point in different ways, don't they? I mean, would you accept to cut through, if we accord with RE1 and RE3, as well as FNP 1 and 10, we would, for the same reason, accord with the other policies. They don't add anything to those main strategic policies in this context.
They're the main principal policies. There are design policies that are quoted on the reason for refusal.
Yes, but that's not the point I'm making. The point is, if the inspector thinks, contrary to the reason for refusal, we are in accordance with RE1 and RE3, and with FNP1 and FNP10, then there'd be no the other policies would also be complied with. Nothing else they add. They're different ways of saying the same thing. Is that right? In the context of this case?
In the context of this case, when we're looking at the size and scale of the building, I think the design policies are particularly relevant where we're looking at local distinctiveness of the building. I accept in principle terms a building could be acceptable of a size and scale to comply with RE1 and RE3, and similar but not the same principles apply with FNP1 and FNP10 of the principle of development.
Maybe you're misunderstanding my question. Maybe it's because I haven't explained it well. The reason for refusal is not about local distinction. It's about openness, effect on openness, and thus character, not visual effects, from size and scale of the building and the infrastructure, right? And so the point is, if the inspector were to find that there is no grounds for objection on that basis in relation to RE1, RE3, FNP1 and FNP10, it would follow, wouldn't it, that we're also in compliance with design policies? Or do you say that actually there could still be a non-compliance with the design policies, even if we comply with RE1 and RE3, FNP1 and FNP10, that they could pull in different directions?
I think, consideration of those design policies is important, and it doesn't necessarily follow if you accept the principle that the actual design, because of the implications of size and scale, and the choice of materials that has, that the building would necessarily comply with those policies.
Again, I think you're misunderstanding the question. If the building, the proposed development, by virtue of size, the building, by virtue of size and scale, would adversely affect openness and thus character of the area, if that harm would happen, and if that would lead to a breach of RE1 and RE3 and FNP1 and FNP10, then for the same reasons, there'd probably be a breach of the design policies too. But if in fact there is accordance with RE1, so there's no openness objection that leads to a breach of RE1, no openness objection that leads to a breach of RE3, no openness objection that leads to a breach of FNP1 or FNP10, are you saying that despite there being no openness objection under those policies, there could still be an openness objection under the design policies? Just talk me through how that would work.
In assessing the proposal as a whole,
yeah,
it is necessary, and I completely agree with you on your point of RE1, RE3, FNP1 and 10. But there's a duty to also assess the scheme under the design policy, and it doesn't follow just because a building might be of a suitable size and scale that the choice of materials that have been made actually accords with the policies on design.
But that's no part of the reason for refusal. I'm going to cut across you. The reason for refusal is not about materials. We've agreed that. I mean, I suggest to you that on a proper analysis, the policy objections stand or fall together. We're either in breach of all of them or in breach of none of them. There's no scope, based upon how the reasons for refusal are calibrated, there's no scope for us to be in conflict with some and in accordance with others. You either win in relation to all the policies or lose by relation to all the policies. So yes, you obviously consider them all, but they don't lead to different result. Or I mean, it's fine if you want to spend another hour, we'll go through each one. I've got notes, but I'm trying to give you and the inspector a way out here. It's up to you whether you take it. Do you understand the point?
I understand the question, sir. Yes.
It stands or falls together.
Yes.
Isn't that right?
I agree. They do stand and fall together.
Good.
Yes.
Good. Okay, that's saves now. Thank you. Just on the FNP policies. So, I mean, it's the same point, really, both in relation to FNP 1 and 10. Do you agree that they're not zero harm or zero change policies? They have a degree of tolerance?
Can we deal with them just separately so I can read them independently? Just trying to find FNP 1 at the moment. FNP 1. And we're looking at the principle of a building.
I mean, it's talking about new development. That's a bit of a clue that it shouldn't be interpreted in such a way as to prohibit all development.
Oh, I just wanted to clarify, you weren't suggesting I thought that the proposal complied with this policy.
Well, I'm suggesting that, obviously. But the point is, in terms of interpretation, do we treat this as a policy that is opposed to all greenfield development, or that has a sphere of tolerance in the way that RE1 and RE3 have?
I agree with you. There is tolerance.
By the sound of it. And then FNP 10, just to clear up one point, if we're trying to work through FNP 10, outside the built-up area boundary, it does contemplate development. So clearly it can't be a no-harm policy, otherwise it would be contradictory in its terms.
Yes, I agree. It's not a restrictive policy, and it actually includes development that may be acceptable.
Yes, it does. But I just wanted to deal with, because it requires accordance with FNP 16 or 20 of the neighbourhood plan or other relevant policies applying to the area, and those other relevant policies applying to the area would include, and we'll come to it in a moment, ICS 1 of the local plan, of LPP 1.
Yes, I agree.
But let's just say for the moment it doesn't. We don't agree that it's outside ICS 1, but let's just assume if we look at it's not. If we go to FNP 20, which says it's on page 75 of the hard copy of the FNP, so presumably 36, 38. And outside the built-up area boundary, following proposals, subject to the various design and landscaping things in the sphere of tolerance in FNP 10, certain kinds of uses, so business or tourist uses, for example. So there's a subject to the ICS 1 point, there's a restriction on use, but it's not actually any part of the council's case that if this is appropriately designed, so there's no, we're within the sphere of tolerance of the policy, it's no part of the case of, well, we should still fail because it's not a business or tourist use. No part of the council's case, that is it.
No, I don't think FNP 20 is mentioned.
So just to be clear, even if, and we don't accept that's the case, even if the proper interpretation of FNP 10 would be that this kind of, it wouldn't extend to this kind of use. So even if we are within the sphere of tolerance of impact with a wrong use, even if that were the interpretation of FNP 10 and there was a degree of conflict, we would still be in accordance with the development plan as a whole, wouldn't we? Provided that we were within the sphere of tolerance of impacts of the policies.
If you're within the sphere of tolerance of the policies.
In light of that, I won't waste time asking about ICS 1. I'll just deal with that with Mr. Steele because it doesn't really matter whether we are within or without it. The real question is not the use, but whether we're within the sphere of tolerance. Is that right?
It is. I think what it requires to be in accordance with those policies. Clearly, not every part of that policy is ever going to apply, for example, to protect the green belt because we're not in the green belt. But there is "and" at the end of point E, so they're not mutually exclusive.
Thank you.
Mr. Banner, just on a time basis, if you can kind of look to find a natural point where you can break your questions. I don't want to break your flow.
One more question.
Yes, and then that's absolutely fine. Then let me know when it's an agreeable time for you to pause.
Thank you, sir. So now we've really agreed that the what the reason for refusal comes down to in relation to all the policies is, does the building, the parking and the access way, does that affect openness and thus character, but not visual effects, character, beyond the sphere of tolerance of those policies? That's the critical issue, but that's between us, isn't it?
Yes, I think.
Now, with that in mind, can we go back to Ms. Ritson's proof and the passage, one of the passages you referred to in your evidence in chief? And it was early on in the methodology. Let me find the paragraph. (1.2.9) on page 3. Do you have that paragraph? 1.2.9.
I do.
And do you remember in chief very early on? It was the passage was put to you about 6 or 7 lines down. The SLR methodology, which has been tried and tested at various appeals, regards major and major moderate as important planning considerations and landscape visual appraisals or significant effects in the EIA context. Moderate effects not generally considered to be important considerations, subject to the points that they referred to later. And it was put to you, and then the examination proceeded on the basis that that means that Ms. Ritson has discounted, not taken into account, major moderate effects. And that's not what she says. She doesn't say she discounted them, does she? There's a question of ranking of importance.
There's a ranking of importance, and I think I did accept there was different significance that would be attached to different impacts. But she does say that moderate effects are not generally considered to be important planning considerations. Or stroke.
It's important not to cut
significant
off a
effects.
sentence halfway,
Yeah,
less than
yeah.
halfway through. The sentence does actually go on
an
for 5 more
assessor,
lines, doesn't
yeah,
it?
may conclude some moderate effects may constitute significant effects in certain circumstances.
Let's be clear here. Firstly, any suggestion that Ms Ritson has ignored moderate or low effects is just simply wrong.
I don't think I actually said that she's ignored them. That wasn't the evidence I gave to the inquiry. What I gave is that in making my planning judgment, we've established I'm not providing landscape evidence, nor am I seeking to, that actually by making reference to moderate effects, it actually has an implied reduction in their application.
Moderate effects are obviously less important than major moderate effects, obviously.
Yes, they are, absolutely. But also, I think it's important, though, the second part of that sentence, that the assessor may conclude some moderate effects could be significant in certain circumstances, and then goes on to clarify where there are several moderate effects in a particularly sensitive receptor.
Would you accept this, that the grading of the effects, whether it's major, moderate, or indeed less than that, where effects fall in that grading may inform the judgment of whether the effects of the development are within the sphere of tolerance of the policies? Do you agree with that? It may inform
May inform,
yes.
If we're using the word inform, yes.
Mr. Barron, is this leading much further?
No, I don't think so. Can I just double check, because there's nothing to sweep up, and then that will be it. So, may inform the judgment of whether within sphere of tolerance of the policies. Yeah, there's 2 or 3 questions on design policy, but I think that let's pause now, and I'll just deal with design policy after lunch before we get into some of the consideration of effects. So thank you, Mr. Collett, so far. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Yes, it's just slightly after 1 now. Mr. Green, are you okay? Your witness is aware of the need to be kept to be separate. You're an experienced witness, so I trust that that'll be followed. Assuming there's no other procedural matters or housekeeping matters, I'm happy to adjourn now for lunch. So it's 13:02. If it's agreeable, if we return for 2 o'clock, it's only slightly under an hour. I think that's okay. Okay, 13:02. So we'll adjourn now and we'll resume at 2 o'clock. Thank you all for your contributions this morning. Thank you.